From China's $50 billion effort to build Manhattan that was eventually deserted, to Stalin's abandoned dream of building a 500-meter-tall palace to assert the triumph of communism. And from America's nuclear stations that could not get off the ground to a crumbled Nazi capital planned to replace Berlin, these are some of the biggest abandoned megaprojects through history. Don't miss out as we tell the story of what went wrong for these colossal plans and why some of them might be rising from the dead. These are the 31 biggest abandoned megaprojects in history. In 2020, Guangzhou Evergrande Football Club unveiled plans for what would be the world's largest football stadium, a 100,000-seat colossus designed to look like a blooming lotus flower when viewed from above. The renderings showed a spectacular structure with a golden metallic exterior, sweeping curves, and a roof that seemed to float above the seating bowl. It would dwarf every football stadium in existence, larger than Barcelona's Camp Nou, bigger than Real Madrid's Santiago Bernabeu, and more expensive than anything similar ever built. It all began with the rise of the Chinese Super League and the dominance of a football club owned by Evergrande, one of China's largest property developers. The club won 8 Chinese Super League championships in 9 years, recruited expensive foreign players, and hired world-class coaches. Chairman Xu Jiayin wanted a stadium worthy of this success and facilities that would make European megastadiums look ordinary. The location was Guangzhou's Panyu district, about 20 kilometers south of the city center on former farmland that Evergrande owned. The stadium would be part of a larger development with shopping, housing, and entertainment. Construction budget was announced at $1.7 billion, a staggering sum that seemed justified by the scale and ambition. Groundbreaking happened in April 2020 with completion targeted for late 2022. The construction moved fast initially. Within months, the massive foundation was complete and structural steelwork began rising. The lotus petal design required complex, curved steel members that had to be fabricated precisely and lifted into place by enormous cranes. Thousands of workers swarmed the site, pouring concrete, welding steel, and assembling the framework that would support the distinctive golden facade. By mid-2021, the steel structure was substantially complete, and the stadium's shape was clearly visible, the lotus petals recognizable even without the finished cladding. But Evergrande Group was collapsing. The company had borrowed staggering amounts to fund its expansion. It had over $300 billion in total liabilities, including debts to banks, suppliers, and buyers of unfinished apartments. Chinese regulators had imposed restrictions on property developer borrowing in 2020 to cool the overheated real estate market, and Evergrande couldn't refinance its debts. By late 2021, the company was defaulting on bond payments and desperately trying to avoid bankruptcy. The stadium construction slowed as Evergrande ran out of cash. Workers went unpaid and suppliers stopped delivering materials. The golden facade that was supposed to clad the steel structure never arrived. Installation of seats, luxury boxes, mechanical systems, and all the interior finishing work stopped. By early 2022, the site was essentially abandoned, the skeleton of a stadium standing incomplete while Evergrande fought for survival in China's courts. The incomplete stadium became a symbol of Evergrande's hubris and China's property sector collapse. This wasn't supposed to happen to massive state-connected companies like Evergrande. They were too big to fail, too important to the economy, too tied to local governments that depended on property development for revenue. But Evergrande did fail spectacularly, and projects like the stadium were collateral damage. As of 2025, the Guangzhou Evergrande Stadium still stands unfinished. The steel structure is complete, but exposed to weather without protective cladding. Rust is appearing on structural members. The site is fenced and abandoned, with construction equipment sitting idle and materials deteriorating. Weeds grow through the foundation, and the partially built access roads lead to nothing. From a distance, the lotus flower shape is still recognizable, but up close, it's clearly a construction failure frozen in time. The stadium was supposed to open in late 2022 for the Asian Cup that China was scheduled to host. When Evergrande's collapse made that impossible, Chinese football authorities relocated the tournament to Qatar. Guangzhou lost its chance to showcase a world-class venue, and the national team lost a potential home advantage. The incomplete stadium mocked both the club's ambitions and China's football dreams. Evergrande Football Club itself struggled after the parent company's collapse. Player salaries went unpaid, stars left for other teams, and the club was relegated from the Chinese Super League after withdrawing from competition. The team that was supposed to fill a 100,000-seat stadium couldn't even field a competitive squad. Chinese football authorities eventually took control of the club and are trying to rebuild it, but the glory years are clearly over. There have been occasional announcements about completing the stadium, but nothing materializes. Local Guangzhou government officials talk about finding new investors or taking over the project, but a half-finished stadium that needs hundreds of millions to complete isn't attractive to anyone. Completing it would require not just finishing construction, but also figuring out how to fill 100,000 seats when Chinese football attendance has collapsed and Evergrande's team is in lower divisions. The Lotus Flower Stadium has become an unintentional tourist attraction, with locals visiting the site to take photos of the abandoned structure, which is now a rusting steel skeleton slowly deteriorating, waiting for a future that probably won't come. But before there was a football infrastructure boom, China was interested in Western-style theme parks. Rivaling the size of Disney, these megabuilds failed to live up to the billing, like the next megaproject on our list. By the end of World War I, France had lost nearly 1.4 million soldiers. Entire generations had been fed into the trenches of the Western Front and never came back. Whole regions of the country had been shelled into rubble. When the war finally ended, one question dominated French military thinking above all others. How do we make sure this never happens again? Their answer was concrete, enormous, extraordinary amounts of it. Under direction of André Maginot, France's Minister of War, France was to build the most sophisticated fortification system ever conceived along the entire German border. Construction of the Maginot Line began in 1929. What his engineers built along the Franco-German border over the following decade was genuinely staggering. 45 major fortress complexes, nearly 100 smaller forts, hundreds of reinforced bunkers, and over 100 kilometers of underground tunnels connecting them all. The tunnels contained electric railways, hospitals, air conditioning systems, ammunition depots, and living quarters for thousands of soldiers. The concrete walls were thick enough to absorb direct hits from the heaviest artillery in the world. The whole thing cost around 3 billion French francs, roughly equivalent to $9 billion today, and took 11 years to complete. The Maginot Line, that stretched nearly 450 kilometers from Switzerland to the Belgian border, was arguably the most sophisticated defensive fortification ever built. However, it had one critical gap. France did not extend the fortifications along the Belgian border because Belgium was an ally, and fortifying that border would imply France expected Belgium to fall. The Ardennes forest on the Belgian-French border was considered impassable to modern armies, so it was lightly defended. The Maginot Line covered the direct German border, but left the Belgian approach protected mainly by treaties and optimism. On May 10, 1940, France's worst fears came true. Germany invaded not through the 450-kilometer fortifications, but through Belgium. They bypassed the Maginot Line entirely and broke through the complicated terrain of the Ardennes forest. German tanks raced through the forest, crossed into France north of the fortifications, and drove toward Paris. The massive forts along the German border sat fully manned and ready to fight, but the war was happening 100 kilometers away. The Maginot Line itself was never breached. The soldiers manning its forts fought on, some holding out even after France had fallen. The fortifications did exactly what they were built to do. They just couldn't compensate for a military doctrine that hadn't reckoned with how completely the nature of warfare had changed since 1918. France fell in 6 weeks. The Maginot Line sat intact, irrelevant behind the battle. Much of it still exists today. Sections have been opened as museums, where visitors can walk the underground tunnels and stand at the gun emplacements that were never fired in the direction that mattered. It remains the largest surviving artifact of the Second World War, a structure so well built that it has outlasted nearly everything around it, a reminder that you can construct something perfectly and still have it fail completely. simply because you built it to fight the last war instead of the next one. The Maginot Line wasn't abandoned in the traditional sense, it just became obsolete before it was ever used. From France's static defenses that were bypassed, we cross over to Germany and to a billion-dollar convention center that was never finished. The Las Vegas Strip has been America's go-to-entertainment destination for decades. It is home to some of the world's biggest entertainment venues and iconic landmarks. However, while the Vegas Strip tells thousands of stories of success, it has had its fair share of abandoned megaprojects. One such plan was to build a 77-acre London-themed casino development across from Mandalay Bay. Old motels in the area were demolished, but World Port was never built. The development was going to cost $1.8 billion and would include famous British landmarks like Big Ben, Tower Bridge, and the London Eye. Guests could ride boats down a small version of the River Thames, watch a daily changing of the guard show, and enjoy classic pubs and theater performances like the ones in London's West End. The mega resort was planned to have 1,300 hotel rooms and a 500-foot-tall observation wheel named Sky View. Construction got delayed as the 2008 financial crisis made it hard to get funding for the entire project. The plan wasn't canceled altogether, however. The only construction that did materialize was on the Skyview Ferris wheel. Announced in 2011, the $200 million Ferris wheel would give visitors the unparalleled view of Sin City. A 1950s-era motel was demolished to make way for a mixed-use complex that would feature the giant wheel, a roller coaster, and 200,000 square feet of restaurant, retail, and entertainment venues. Foundation work began in 2012 with the opening date slated for July 2013. The project was planned to employ roughly 700 people during the construction phase, followed by 500 full-time jobs once the venue got operational. Once completed, the wheel was supposed to be the most notable fixture of a city where there is no shortage of eye-catching infrastructure. The towering structure would feature 32 gondolas that each seat 24 people. This was the tallest billboard in the world. Howard Bullock was confident of the wheel's success, saying, "Every airplane that flies in and out of Vegas will fly past that wheel." The confidence also came from the popularity of its inspiration, the London Eye. The wheel in London attracted more than 3 million visitors per year, and the Skyview aimed to top that. However, as soon as the construction began, the project ran into funding problems. Only a third of the required funds was secured through a Seattle businessman who brought lawsuits against Bullock afterwards. While Skyview was mired in controversy, its competitors were motoring ahead. Caesars Entertainment landed financing for its wheel before construction started. The gaming giant's version of the wheel, the High Roller, opened in 2014, further complicating the future for Skyview. It wasn't long before the project stalled altogether. When it was abandoned, the only construction were 2 massive concrete support columns visible from a distance. Despite multiple attempts to sell the property since 2015, the site remains undeveloped today. From high up in the Vegas skyline, we move to Cincinnati, Ohio, where the city tried to build its first subway system more than a century ago. In 1998, developers broke ground on what was supposed to become the largest amusement park in Asia, a Chinese Disneyland that would dwarf every theme park in the region and establish China as a destination for family entertainment. Wonderland would cover 120 acres just outside Beijing, featuring castles larger than Disney's, roller coasters more extreme than anything in the West, and themed areas representing different fairy tale kingdoms. The renderings showed towering spires, elaborate attractions, and crowds of happy visitors enjoying a world-class theme park in communist China. The Thai real estate conglomerate Rainwood Group was financing the project with estimated costs over $1 billion, an enormous sum in 1990s China. They'd acquired farmland in Qianzhuang Village, about 45 kilometers from central Beijing, betting that Beijing's rapidly growing middle class would flock to a massive theme park once it opened. The location made sense, close enough to Beijing for day trips, but far enough that land was cheap and available in large quantities. Construction started with impressive speed. Workers began building the park's centerpiece, an enormous castle that would serve as Wonderland's icon, visible for kilometers across the flat farmland. The castle's foundation was massive, designed to support a structure that would rise over 30 meters with multiple towers and elaborate architectural details. Around the castle, crews excavated foundations for major attractions and began installing infrastructure: water lines, electrical systems, access roads connecting different park areas. By 1999, the castle's basic structure was taking shape. Concrete walls rose from the foundation, and steel reinforcement created the framework for towers and turrets. The scale was genuinely impressive. This wasn't a modest regional park, but a genuine attempt to build something that could compete internationally. Workers poured thousands of tons of concrete and erected steel frameworks for other structures across the site. But just as the excitement was building, the project stalled. Rainwood Group got into disputes with the local government over land payments and development rights. Both sides blamed each other for failed negotiations. But the result was construction grinding to a halt in 1998, just months after starting. Workers left the site, equipment sat idle, and partially built structures began weathering without protection. The timing was particularly bad because the 1997 Asian financial crisis had devastated property markets across the region. Thai companies like Rainwood suddenly faced liquidity problems and couldn't access the capital needed to complete expensive projects. Wonderland needed hundreds of millions more to finish, and that money wasn't available. For over a decade, the abandoned park sat frozen in partial construction. The castle remained the most visible feature, with concrete walls and steel reinforcement exposed to weather, windows never installed, and the towers unfinished. Around it, foundations for other attractions slowly filled with water and debris. Vegetation began reclaiming the site as weeds grew through cracks in concrete and vines climbed the castle walls. Local farmers moved back onto parts of the land, planting corn between the abandoned structures. The surreal images of farmland surrounding a decaying fantasy castle became internationally famous, with photographers documenting the abandoned dreams. The castle walls provided shelter for farming equipment, and irrigation channels ran past concrete foundations that were supposed to support roller coasters. Instead of a weekend getaway, the site became a minor tourist attraction for urban explorers and photographers fascinated by the decay. People would drive out from Beijing to photograph the ruins, climb through the abandoned castle, and document the slow reclamation by nature. The images circulated online, making Wonderland one of the world's most famous abandoned theme parks, despite never actually opening. In 2008, there were announcements about reviving the project. New investors supposedly wanted to complete Wonderland and finally open the park a decade late. Some minor construction activity resumed, but nothing substantial materialized. The revival attempts fizzled as potential investors realized the project would need complete reconstruction. Too much damage had occurred during abandonment. Building codes had changed, and the partially built structures couldn't simply be finished. They'd need to be demolished and rebuilt. By 2013, patience ran out. Local authorities ordered demolition of the abandoned structures to reclaim the land. The castle that had stood incomplete for 15 years was torn down, along with all the other partially built attractions. Demolition crews spent months breaking apart concrete, hauling away steel, and clearing the site. The work that had taken months to build in the 1990s took equally long to demolish in 2013. Today, the Wonderland site is farmland again. Corn and other crops grow where the castle once stood. There's virtually no trace of the theme park except some old foundations buried under soil and the faint outlines of roads visible in satellite images. The $1+ billion that Rainwood invested is completely gone, demolished, and returned to agricultural use without ever generating a single yuan in revenue. Even after demolition, Wonderland remains culturally significant as an unforgettable image of ambition destroyed by reality. While Wonderland got demolished, there's another billion-dollar theme park that still stands to serve as a reminder of construction failure. In the divided Berlin of the 1970s, everything was political. The wall had been standing for over a decade, cutting the city in two, and on each side the same silent competition played out in concrete and steel, each government trying to demonstrate through its buildings that its way of life was the one worth choosing. By the 1960s, the West wanted to demonstrate its progress, modernity, and global relevance. To turn that vision into reality, Germany decided to build the largest convention center in Europe. It was named the Internationales Kongresszentrum, the ICC, and remains one of the most extraordinary buildings in Germany. Designed by the husband and wife architectural team of Ralf Schuler and Ursulina Schuler-Witte, who won the commission as relative unknowns in 1966, the building would look like nothing else in Berlin. It would stretch 320 meters along a motorway and was clad entirely in brushed aluminum that catches the light like the hull of a spacecraft. Berliners immediately started calling it the spaceship, and the nickname stuck. Inside, it could accommodate over 20,000 people across 80 conference rooms, with a main auditorium holding 5,000 people. The building was to reinforce West Berlin's identity as a vibrant, forward-looking city despite its isolation deep inside East Germany. Construction began in 1973 on a site near the western edge of West Berlin and was completed by 1979. The project was extraordinarily expensive, over 1 billion Deutsche Marks, which made it one of the most costly buildings in Germany at the time. The city justified this by projecting that the ICC would host hundreds of conferences annually, generating tourism revenue and establishing Berlin as a hub for international gatherings. And for a while, it delivered. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, the ICC was the premier congress venue in Europe, drawing international conferences, trade shows, and political summits. It won design awards, appeared in films, and hosted some of the most notable dignitaries in the world. That, as it turned out, was the beginning of the end. Reunification changed everything about Berlin's position in the world. West Berlin had been a showcase, a statement, a city that needed to prove itself precisely because of its extraordinary circumstances. Once Germany was reunified and the political point no longer needed making, the ICC's reason for existing became much harder to justify. The building was enormous, expensive to run, and increasingly out of step with what modern conference organizers needed. The room layout was inflexible. The technology was aging. Rivals in Frankfurt and Hamburg were newer and more efficient. The ICC kept operating, but it kept losing money too. Then in 2014, the building was closed for asbestos contamination requiring removal. However, once the doors closed, they never reopened. Since then, Berlin has been trying to figure out what to do with it. Demolition isn't really an option. The cost of removing the remaining asbestos and tearing down a reinforced concrete building of this scale would be staggering. In late 2024, the city launched a formal competition for private investors to submit proposals for its future use, with a 99-year lease on offer. A consortium was selected in 2025 and is currently developing plans focused on art, culture, and innovation. Whether any of that actually happens remains to be seen. The ICC has been waiting for its second act for over a decade, a billion-euro spaceship grounded on a West Berlin motorway. Still extraordinary, still stubbornly there, a building that outlasted the ideology that built it and is still searching for a reason to exist in the world that replaced it. From Berlin's conference center that outlived its purpose, we go back further to an even grander vision for reshaping the city. Cincinnati in the 1910s was growing fast and choking on its own success. The city's population had doubled in 20 years. Streetcars were packed beyond capacity, and traffic clogged downtown streets that were never designed for automobile traffic. City planners looked at what New York and Boston had done with underground rapid transit and decided Cincinnati needed the same subway solution. The plan approved in 1916 called for a 16-mile subway loop connecting downtown Cincinnati to surrounding neighborhoods. Trains would run underground through the city center, then emerge to street level in outlying areas where land was cheaper and tunneling unnecessary. The subway would relieve the overcrowded streetcar system and position Cincinnati as a modern city with infrastructure rivaling the East Coast's major metros. The projected cost was $6 million, though that number would prove spectacularly wrong. Cincinnati voters approved a bond issue to fund construction, and work began in 1920 with major optimism speeches about the city's future. Workers started excavating tunnels beneath downtown streets, boring through rock and clay to create passages wide enough for two-track rapid transit. In some sections, they bored through solid rock, using techniques adapted from mining. Progress was visible as streets got torn up, and tunnel portals appeared where the subway would emerge from underground. By 1922, substantial progress had been made. Over 2 miles of tunnel were complete beneath downtown Cincinnati, including the main tube running under Central Parkway and Race Street. The tunnels were arched concrete structures 20 feet wide and 18 feet high, large enough for subway trains with room for ventilation and utilities. 6 stations were under construction, with platforms roughed out and spaces excavated for entrances and exits. But costs were spiraling beyond anyone's projections. The $6 million bond issue was consumed by 1922, with only a fraction of the planned system complete. Excavating through Cincinnati's difficult geology proved more expensive than estimated. Labor costs increased after World War I. Materials became more expensive as post-war inflation hit. City officials went back to voters asking for more money and got rejected. The public had approved $6 million for a complete subway system, not an open-ended commitment to fund cost overruns. The automobile boom was changing the calculation too. When planning began in 1916, cars were luxury items and most people relied on streetcars. By 1923, automobile ownership was spreading rapidly and city officials were starting to think that maybe investing in roads made more sense than building expensive subway tunnels. The streetcar companies that supported the subway initially were now worried that rapid transit would compete with their services. Construction slowed through 1923 and 1924 as funding dried up and political support weakened. Workers completed some sections they'd already started, but no new tunnel excavation began. The project entered a zombie state, not officially canceled, but not actively progressing either, with city officials arguing about whether to find more money or cut their losses. In 1925, Cincinnati officially halted construction on the subway. About 2.2 miles of tunnel were complete, along with partially finished station structures, representing maybe 15% of the original plan. The completed sections sat there underground, empty and useless because they didn't connect to anything. The city explored various ideas for using the tunnels. Maybe they could be converted for automobile traffic. Maybe utilities could use them. Maybe they could be storage facilities. None of these ideas made financial sense as they would require expensive modifications. Eventually, the decision was taken to seal the tunnels and simply abandon the megaproject. The entrances were sealed, construction equipment was removed, and the underground spaces were left empty. For decades, the Cincinnati subway existed as one of America's oddest infrastructure failures. Miles of tunnel sitting unused beneath a major city because nobody could figure out what to do with them. Through the decades, the tunnels became urban legend. People knew they existed, but few had seen inside. Water seeped in from groundwater, and some sections flooded partially, but the concrete structures remained intact. The megaproject saw brief consideration for reactivation several times. In the 1930s, there was talk of completing the system as a WPA project. In the 1950s, officials discussed using them for civil defense shelters. In the 1980s and 2000s, various proposals suggested converting them into a light rail line or subway. None of these ideas progressed beyond planning stages. The costs of completing or converting the tunnels always exceeded what Cincinnati was willing to spend. A century later, the Cincinnati subway tunnels are still there, exactly where they were abandoned in 1925. The city occasionally opens them for public tours, allowing people to walk through the empty concrete passages and see the platforms that never served passengers. The tunnels to this day are in remarkable condition. The concrete is solid, the arches are intact, and they look like they could be put into service. However, the stations look like eerie time capsules. Platform edges are visible where subway trains would have stopped. Spaces excavated for ticket booths and entrances remain empty. It's like walking through a subway system that was frozen in time. Cincinnati spent $13 million on the project in the 1920s, equivalent to $200 million in today's money, but all they managed to build was 2.2 miles of tunnel that never transported a passenger. From Ohio, we now move to Indiana, to one of the most expensive abandoned nuclear construction projects in U.S. history. Zhejiang Province in eastern China has been one of the country's wealthiest regions for decades, home to successful manufacturing, thriving private businesses, and a population with money to spend on entertainment. In the mid-2000s, a developer looked at this prosperity and decided to build a theme park that would rival the best parks in the world. Nine Rivers Great World was announced around 2006 as a comprehensive entertainment destination covering over 1,000 acres near Hangzhou. The name referenced 9 waterways that supposedly flowed through the region. The plans called for multiple themed zones, a water park with elaborate slides and pools, adventure areas with rides and attractions, cultural zones celebrating Chinese history and mythology, plus hotels, restaurants, and shopping complexes. The developer projected this would become one of China's premier tourist destinations, drawing millions of visitors annually from Zhejiang and neighboring provinces. Estimates suggested investments of at least several $100 million, possibly exceeding $1 billion when all components were included. The scale certainly justified massive spending. This wasn't a simple amusement park, but an entire entertainment district built from nothing on previously undeveloped land. Construction began in the late 2000s with the usual Chinese development speed. Earth movers reshaped the landscape, creating artificial hills and excavating lakes. Workers poured foundations for major structures and began building what would become the park's most distinctive features. The water park section progressed furthest, with massive concrete structures rising that were designed to support elaborate water slides, wave pools, and aquatic attractions. The most striking construction was a series of enormous concrete slides and water attractions that climbed over 20 meters high, visible from miles away. The concrete work alone required thousands of cubic meters of material and months of construction. Support structures for pools and splash areas spread across acres of land, connected by walkways and service roads. Other sections saw less progress. The themed entertainment areas had foundations poured and some structural work begun, but nothing approaching completion. Hotels were started with only ground floors and basements built. The cultural zones celebrating Chinese history never advanced beyond site preparation. Some areas substantially built, while others remained empty dirt lots with stakes marking where future attractions were supposed to go. The developer ran out of money sometime around 2010. Construction stopped abruptly, with work crews leaving mid-project. The water park structures stood incomplete, concrete slides that led nowhere, pools that were never waterproofed, pump rooms with equipment never installed. The elaborate main entrance with its ticket buildings and guest services remained partially built, with walls up but no roof or windows. Access roads connected nothing to nothing, ending abruptly at sections where construction never started. For over a decade, Nine Rivers Great World sat abandoned. The massive concrete water slides became the site's most photographed features, towering gray structures deteriorating in the subtropical weather. Without protective coatings or maintenance, the concrete began cracking and spalling. Rust bled from exposed rebar. The curves and channels designed to provide thrilling water rides instead collected rainwater, leaves, and debris. The artificial lakes that were excavated for water attractions filled with stagnant water and became breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Local residents sometimes used parts of the site informally. The roads made decent shortcuts through the area. The empty pools and structures became playgrounds for adventurous kids. Scavengers stripped anything valuable: copper wiring, metal fixtures, equipment that hadn't already been removed. The site slowly degraded from abandoned construction project to dangerous ruins. There were occasional rumors about revival attempts. New investors supposedly wanted to complete Nine Rivers Great World or repurpose it into something else, but nothing happened for years. The site was too damaged to simply resume construction. Too much deterioration had occurred. Starting over would require demolishing the existing structures and rebuilding from scratch, which was expensive and pointless when the original developer's failure suggested the business case was flawed. By the late 2000s, authorities began clearing parts of the site. Some structures were demolished and the land reclaimed for other purposes. Some sections remained abandoned, too expensive to demolish but too damaged to ever complete. As of 2025, portions of Nine Rivers Great World still stand in a state of decay. Some areas have been cleared and redeveloped, others remain frozen as ruins. The ruins serve as backdrops for urban exploration videos and photography projects documenting China's construction waste. From failed theme parks, we move to once-abandoned skyscraper that has finally got a new lease of life and is all set to become the country's second tallest building. At some point in the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler planned a new capital for his 1,000-year Reich. He envisioned a monumental city of granite and marble that would dwarf every other capital on Earth. He called this vision Germania, and he tasked his architect Albert Speer with making it real. This was Germania, Hitler's plan to tear apart one of Europe's great cities and rebuild it as the eternal capital of a 1,000-year empire. The man tasked with making it real was Albert Speer, appointed in 1937 as General Building Inspector for Berlin and given powers that bypassed every government agency and municipal authority in the city. Speer and Hitler had been working on the vision for years, and the scale of what they planned was genuinely staggering. Berlin would be reorganized around a 5-kilometer north-south boulevard, with entire neighborhoods demolished to make room for government buildings, museums, and monuments. The centerpiece was the Volkshalle, the People's Hall. Hitler had sketched the original idea himself in 1925, inspired by the Roman Pantheon. The finished design called for a dome 250 meters wide and 290 meters tall, with an interior large enough to hold 180,000 people. The estimated cost for the hall alone was around 1 billion Reichsmarks. The human cost was considered irrelevant. Residents would be relocated, and concentration camp labor would do much of the construction work. Some preliminary work actually began. The Grand Boulevard was partially cleared, with buildings demolished and residents forcibly moved. The Great Hall's foundation was tested by building a massive concrete cylinder that was sunk into the ground to measure how far it would settle. The cylinder sunk 19 centimeters, showing that the arch could never have been built without enormous ground stabilization work first. The empire's architectural ambitions were, quite literally, too heavy for the earth beneath them. Some elements of Germania were actually completed, but the bigger buildings, the Volkshalle and the Grand Plaza, never left the models. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, construction was suspended pending victory. A victory that never came. Allied bombing devastated Berlin, destroying many of the completed buildings and making the grand plans increasingly absurd as Germany faced defeat. The rubble of bombed buildings created ironic parallels to the demolition that was supposed to make room for Germania. Berlin was being cleared, just not in the way Hitler envisioned. The Great Hall was never built. The triumphal arch remained a concept. The Grand Boulevard was partially cleared, but never completed. Most of what Germania would have become existed only in Speer's drawings and Hitler's imagination. The Germania project was quietly shelved for good. The concrete cylinder is still there today, standing in a quiet corner of Tempelhof, slowly sinking into the ground it was built to test. It has been a listed monument since 1995, the most tangible remnant of a project whose ambition was matched only by the catastrophe required to stop it. From Hitler's architectural nightmares in Berlin, we move east to Stalin's equally megalomaniacal vision for Moscow. In 1977, the Public Service Company of Indiana broke ground on what was supposed to be the future of clean energy in the Midwest. Marble Hill Nuclear Power Plant would house 2 massive Westinghouse pressurized water reactors, each generating 1,130 megawatts. Enough to power over 1 million homes. The plant would sit on the Ohio River near Hanover, Indiana, positioned to serve the growing electricity demands of Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio for the next 50 years. The design was nearly identical to the Byron and Braidwood nuclear stations being built in Illinois. 2 containment buildings would house the reactors, backed by cooling towers that would use river water to manage the tremendous heat. The estimated cost was around $1.4 billion, and completion was targeted for the early 1980s. PSY and its partner utilities were confident. Nuclear power was America's future, replacing dirty coal plants with clean atomic energy. Construction moved quickly through 1977 and 1978. Workers poured massive foundations and began erecting the distinctive concrete domes that define nuclear plants. The 2 cooling tower complexes rose nearby, By 1979, the site employed thousands of construction workers, and the project seemed on track despite some early skepticism from environmental groups. The Paddle Wheel Alliance, a regional advocacy organization, staged 2 nonviolent occupations of the property in 1978 and 1979, but construction continued anyway. But just as it felt things were going smoothly, the 3 Mile Island incident happened. On March 28, 1979, a reactor at the Pennsylvania plant suffered a partial meltdown, causing the worst nuclear accident in U.S. history. Nobody died, but the incident terrified the public and transformed nuclear regulation overnight. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission imposed stricter safety requirements, extended review processes, and demanded design changes for plants under construction. What had been routine approvals became years-long battles. Marble Hill's costs started climbing immediately. The new regulations required design modifications, additional safety systems, and more extensive documentation. Construction slowed as engineers redesigned components to meet new standards. Then it was found that the concrete work on the foams was below the acceptable standard, compromising their compromised structural integrity. Fixing this required tearing out sections and redoing the work, a process that consumed months and millions of dollars. By 1981, the cost estimate had more than doubled to over $3 billion. PSY asked Indiana regulators for permission to charge customers for construction work in progress, making the consumers fund an unfinished plant through higher electric bills. The request ignited political controversy. Why should customers pay for a plant that wasn't generating electricity and might never be completed? An already weak local support turned into hostility. By 1983, almost half of the construction was complete. However, the plant was nowhere close to finishing. The rest of the work was more complex and required more investment. PSI ran the numbers and faced a grim reality. They'd spent $2.5 billion and needed at least another $4 billion to finish, nearly triple the original estimate. The company couldn't raise that much capital without bankrupting itself. Indiana's governor, Robert Orr, publicly stated that completing Marble Hill would push PSI into bankruptcy and cause electric rates to skyrocket, devastating the state's economy. On January 10, 1984, PSY officially halted construction. The announcement devastated Jefferson County. Over 3,500 construction workers were laid off overnight. The county's unemployment rate spiked to 24.8%, one of the highest in the nation. Families that had moved to the area for stable nuclear construction jobs suddenly had nothing. The economic impact rippled through local businesses that had depended on thousands of workers with steady paychecks. The $2.8 billion spent was gone, and Marble Hill became the most expensive abandoned nuclear project in American history. PSY tried to salvage what it could. In 1985, they staged an auction selling reactor hardware, generators, and equipment to other utilities. The sale raised about $90 million against a $1.65 billion debt, recovering less than 6 cents on the dollar. The components that were supposed to power Indiana's future ended up installed at nuclear plants in other states. The legal battles consumed years. PSI wanted to recover its investment by charging ratepayers, arguing that the plant was abandoned for reasons beyond their control. Consumer advocates argued that customers shouldn't pay for a plant that would never generate electricity. The Indiana courts eventually sided largely with consumers, denying PSY's attempts to fully recover its losses. The structures abandoned in 1984 remained standing for decades after abandonment. The containment buildings stood as massive concrete monuments to failure, visible for miles around. The site was sold to an agricultural equipment company in 1998, then to a Michigan company in 2005, but nothing was ever built. Demolition of the premises finally began in 2005 and accelerated in the next couple of years. The turbine building proved tougher than expected. The first implosion attempt using dynamite failed to budge the massive 5-story structure. A second demolition effort finally collapsed it. By 2010, most of the structures were gone, the site largely cleared except for some foundations that were too expensive to remove. Today, little evidence remains that Marble Hill was ever there. The land where 2 nuclear reactors were supposed to generate electricity for 50 years is empty. Speaking of demolishing old infrastructure let's move to Chicago, Illinois, where the country's tallest skyscraper was once taking shape. Tianjin, a city of 15 million people, sits 120 kilometers from Beijing, close enough for a 30-minute bullet train ride, but far enough to live in the capital's shadow. The city has massive ports and serious industrial output, but for years it lacked an iconic landmark. In 2008, developers decided to fix this with a building so tall it couldn't be ignored. Golden Finance 117 would climb 597 meters into the sky, one of the tallest buildings in the world when completed. The design twisted as it rose, each floor rotating slightly from the one below, creating a spiraling effect visible from across the city. This wasn't just another office tower. This was Tianjin's bid for recognition. Golden Properties Group funded construction with budgets around $1.5 billion. The twisted design required serious engineering work. Rotating floors meant complex structural calculations to handle wind loads while maintaining the spiral form. Construction moved fast through the early 2000s. Workers poured massive foundations and started climbing. By 2015, the tower had passed 500 meters, and the twisted silhouette was unmistakable against Tianjin's skyline. The structural frame topped out at full height in 2015. Golden Finance 117 had reached 597 meters, and developers announced interior work would complete by 2016, with the building opening in 2017. Reaching structural height meant the concrete and steel skeleton was done, but the real work was just beginning. This is where everything fell apart. Golden Properties ran into severe financial problems as China's property market cooled in the mid-2000s. The company had borrowed heavily, expecting to refinance once the tower opened and generated rental income. But banks tightened lending to property developers, and Golden couldn't access the hundreds of millions needed to complete interior construction. Work slowed dramatically, then stopped entirely around 2016 to 2017. A third of the curtain wall had been installed when construction halted, leaving large sections of the tower as bare concrete exposed to weather. The 2017 opening date came and went, with the building incomplete. Rain and wind battered unprotected concrete. Water infiltrated through incomplete sections, causing rust stains from exposed rebar and deterioration that worsened with each passing year. From across Tianjin, the tower dominated the skyline at 597 meters. Impossible to miss. Up close, it looked like a disaster. The building sat abandoned for years. It became a symbol of overambitious development, a cautionary tale visible from anywhere in the city. For 5 years, Golden Finance 117 stood frozen in this incomplete state. The videos made it look post-apocalyptic, construction materials abandoned where workers left them, tools sitting untouched, empty spaces that were supposed to be luxury offices. In April 2020, the Chinese government introduced strict regulations that effectively banned the construction of new buildings taller than 500 meters. This felt like the end of the road for Tianjin's tallest structure ever, as all signs pointed to a behemoth that would stand abandoned, similar to North Korea's famous incomplete skyscraper. Then something unexpected happened. In 2021, China Energy Engineering Corporation acquired the project from bankrupt Golden Properties. They announced plans to complete the tower, now rebranded as the China Energy Building, with a revised opening target of 2025. Construction resumed in 2022. The first priority was addressing deterioration from the abandoned years, repairing damaged concrete, removing rust, and fixing water damage. Then came completing the curtain wall installation that had stalled halfway through. New crews arrived on site, cranes reappeared, and work that had been frozen since 2016 started moving again. Progress has been visible. The curtain wall installation advanced through 2023 and 2024, covering sections that had stood as bare concrete for years. The distinctive twisted glass facade is now substantially complete on most of the tower. Interior work is progressing floor by floor. The building that looked like a permanent ruin is starting to look like it might actually open. As of 2025, Golden Finance 117 is roughly 90% complete. The exterior is essentially finished, giving the tower its intended appearance of a twisted glass spire. Interior construction continues with different floors at different stages of completion. The lower floors are nearly finished, middle sections are progressing, and upper floors still need substantial work. The current plan calls for the building to open in phases through 2026. China Energy will occupy significant office space themselves. The upper floors will include hotel space and observation decks as originally planned. Whether the building succeeds commercially remains uncertain, but at least it's finally getting completed rather than standing as a permanent monument to failed development. The tower that seemed destined to remain China's tallest abandoned building might actually open and operate, even if it took far longer and cost far more than anyone originally anticipated. Tianjin skyline will soon include a functioning 597-meter tower instead of an incomplete disaster. The twisted silhouette that's been visible but embarrassing for years will finally serve its intended purpose. Whether locals ever stop seeing it as the building that sat abandoned for years is another question, but at least it won't be abandoned anymore. From a skyscraper that soared up to the sky but served no purpose for years, we now move to a mega bridge labeled a bridge to nowhere, as it stood halfway in the middle of a river. Joseph Stalin looked at the Moscow skyline in 1931 and decided it needed something that would prove Soviet superiority over the capitalist world. His plan was the Palace of the Soviets, a building he had been envisioning for a decade. It was to be the largest building in the world. The site Stalin chose for this monument carried symbolic weight. The Cathedral of Christ the Savior, Moscow's largest Orthodox church, would be demolished to make room. The design that was eventually selected by architect Boris Yofan called for a tiered neoclassical tower rising 415 meters into the Moscow sky, taller than the Empire State Building, which had just been completed in New York. At its very top, a 100-meter statue of Lenin would stand with his arm raised, visible from miles across the city. The total height, statue included, would have made it the tallest structure on Earth. The interior Grand Hall would seat over 20,000 people. There was one problem nobody wanted to say out loud. Moscow's ground is soft. River sediments, groundwater, unstable soil that shifts and floods. Engineers drilled test boreholes and began excavating the foundations. The Moskva River kept seeping in. Drainage systems were installed. More pumping, more concrete. The deeper they dug, the more water they found. Construction of the steel frame began in 1937, and a small portion was erected, enough for Soviet newspapers to run triumphant photographs of the project underway. But adequate funding never materialized. The technical challenges kept multiplying. And then, in June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Construction stopped immediately. Workers were diverted into military service. The steel frame that had been erected was dismantled and melted down, used to build bridges needed for the war effort. Where the Cathedral of Christ the Savior had once stood, and where the greatest building in the world was supposed to rise, there was now just an enormous flooded hole in the ground. It stayed that way for years. After the war, Stalin briefly revived talk of resuming construction, but the Soviet Union had more pressing problems: rebuilding entire cities, developing nuclear weapons, feeding its population. The Palace of the Soviets quietly disappeared from official plans. Under Khrushchev in 1958, the decision was made to do something practical with the whole, and it was converted into an open-air heated swimming pool, the largest in the world naturally, because the Soviet Union was still in the business of building the world's largest things. Muscovites swam there through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, in the exact spot where Stalin had blown up a cathedral to build a monument to Lenin that was never built. Then, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the story took one final unexpected turn. In 1990, before the USSR had even formally dissolved, the Russian Orthodox Church received permission to rebuild the Cathedral of Christ the Savior on its original site. The swimming pool was drained and demolished in 1994. Donations poured in from across Russia and from the diaspora abroad. 6 years later, in 2000, the rebuilt cathedral was consecrated. an almost exact replica of the one Stalin had dynamited 7 decades earlier, standing on the same riverbank, looking out over the same city. The Palace of the Soviets was supposed to replace a cathedral with a monument to the permanence of communism. Instead, it left a hole in the ground for 60 years, and the cathedral came back. While one cathedral is back in Europe, we move to another, one that has been in the making for 3 centuries and may finally become a reality. The Chicago skyline defined American architecture for over a century. It is the birthplace of the skyscraper with buildings like the Sears Tower and the John Hancock Center. But by the 2000s, the city had fallen behind in the super tall building race. New York had new towers going up. Dubai was building the Burj Khalifa, and Chicago's last major skyscraper had topped out in the 1970s. Christopher T. Carley, CEO of Fordham development firm, tried to change that as he hired famous Spanish architect Santiago Calatrava to design the Chicago Spire. It was going to be the tallest residential building in the world. The initial estimated cost of the project was close to $1 billion. However, Fordham Development failed to secure the necessary funds and sold the land to Garrett Kelleher of Shelbourne Development. The Chicago Spire would climb 2,000 feet, 150 stories of twisted glass and steel, rising from a lakefront site where the Chicago River meets Lake Michigan. Santiago Calatrava, the Spanish architect famous for bridges and buildings that looked more like sculptures than structures, designed a tower that rotated as it climbed, each floor turning slightly from the one below to create a spiraling form. Calatrava's twisting tower would be unlike anything in Chicago's famously conservative skyline. The building would be taller than any structure between New York and Los Angeles, reclaiming Chicago's position as the city of bold architecture. It would contain luxury condominiums and penthouses going for over $40 million. Kelleher's company, Shelbourne Development, promised completion by 2012. Construction began in 2007 with excavation for the foundation. The site sat right on the lakefront, which meant building below the water table. Workers had to dig down 110 feet to reach bedrock stable enough to anchor a 2,000-foot tower, essentially creating a massive hole that extended below the level of Lake Michigan. Pumps ran continuously to keep groundwater out while crews installed the foundation. The excavation revealed the first serious problem. The geology was worse than surveys had suggested. The bedrock was deeper and less stable than expected, requiring more extensive foundation work. Each delay cost money and pushed the timeline back. By late 2008, only the hole existed, 110 feet deep and 76 feet in diameter, an enormous circular pit that would supposedly anchor America's tallest residential building. Then, the financial crisis hit. The September 2008 collapse of Lehman Brothers and the subsequent economic meltdown destroyed the luxury condo market overnight. Buyers who'd put down deposits started backing out, unwilling or unable to complete purchases on multi-million-dollar apartments. The financing Shelbourne Development had arranged evaporated as banks stopped lending for speculative real estate. Credit markets froze, and luxury developments across America ground to a halt. Kelleher tried to keep the project alive through 2009, renegotiating with lenders and promising buyers that construction would resume soon. But the economics had changed completely. Even if financing could be found, who would buy $40 million penthouses during the worst recession in 80 years? In 2010, Shelbourne Development defaulted on a $76 million construction loan. The hope for Chicago Spire died with that bankruptcy. At the time, the only thing that existed was the 76-foot pit that had cost tens of millions to excavate and required constant pumping to prevent flooding from groundwater and Lake Michigan seepage. Completing the Spire would require over $2 billion in new financing and finding buyers for condos in a market that had collapsed. Pursuing a scaled-back version would require new designs, new permits, and would lose the Calatrava cachet that was supposed to justify the premium prices. Leaving the hole empty meant paying for pumping and security indefinitely. None of the choices were good. The hole sat there for years. This massive excavation on prime lakefront property surrounded by construction fencing. Pumps ran continuously to keep it from flooding, costing money every day while generating zero revenue. The site became an embarrassment, a literal hole in Chicago's skyline where the tallest building in America was supposed to stand. That was until the construction site was taken over by development firm Related Midwest, and they hired Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, the architecture firm that designed the One World Trade Center. But that did not mean a lease of life for Chicago Spire. In fact, it was announced that the plan for America's tallest skyscraper was officially dead. Instead, it will be replaced by two new skyscrapers with more modest heights of 266 meters and 233 meters respectively. The first goal for the new partners was to fill the hole left behind by the Chicago Spire, and they started doing that in 2021, using hundreds of tons of concrete and steel reinforcements. And 4 years later, the new building has started taking shape and has even reached a third of the final expected height. While the Chicago Spire was replaced with a different megaproject, Alaska's billion-dollar plan remains stalled to this day. Yalu River marks where China ends and North Korea begins, a 790-kilometer border that's been there since the Korean War armistice split the peninsula. For decades, one aging bridge near Dandong carried all the road traffic between the two countries, a cramped 1940s-era crossing that was never designed for modern freight trucks. By the 2000s, the bridge was a bottleneck, strangling what little trade existed between China and North Korea. China had plans to change this. In 2010, Beijing and Pyongyang signed agreements for a modern 4-lane highway bridge that would transform cross-border logistics. The new Yalu River Bridge would span the river with proper clearances for shipping and capacity for heavy trucks. China would build the Chinese half, North Korea would build their half, and the two sections would meet at the border midpoint. Simple. The project carried obvious benefits for China's northeastern provinces. Liaoning and Jilin had struggled economically for years as old state industries declined. A modern bridge could turn Dandong into a logistics hub serving North Korean trade, creating jobs and development in a region that desperately needed both. The $350 million cost would be almost entirely Chinese money, but that seemed acceptable if it unlocked North Korean economic potential. Construction on the Chinese side began in 2011. The bridge design was straightforward, a cable-stayed span with the main tower on Chinese territory and approach viaducts connecting to existing highways near Dandong. Chinese construction companies had built hundreds of similar bridges and knew exactly what they were doing. Work progressed smoothly through 2012 and 2013, concrete rising from the Yalu riverbank as the bridge took shape. By 2014, the Chinese half was finished. A modern 4-lane highway bridge extended from Dandong to the exact center of the Yalu River, where it stopped. The cable-stay tower stood complete. The deck was paved and marked, and barriers were installed at the bridge's terminus. You could drive from Dandong onto the bridge, cross half the Yalu River, and hit a barrier preventing you from driving off the edge into nothing. The bridge just ended at the midpoint, waiting for a North Korean section that showed no signs of appearing. North Korea's side of the river remained completely unchanged. No construction, no approach roads, no indication that North Korea had any intention of building their portion. The agreement called for North Korea to build their half of the bridge plus connecting highways to make the crossing useful. None of this materialized. The North Korean riverbank looked exactly as it had in 2010 when agreements were signed. Undeveloped land with no construction activity whatsoever. China tried diplomatic pressure. Officials raised the issue in bilateral meetings, reminding North Korea of their commitments and offering technical assistance. Beijing even suggested Chinese contractors could build the North Korean section if Pyongyang couldn't manage it themselves. The responses from Pyongyang were vague promises and assurances that construction would begin soon, followed by more years of inaction. The reasons for North Korea's failure were obvious to anyone paying attention. The country's economy had collapsed in the 1990s and never recovered. North Korea struggles to maintain roads and bridges built decades ago, let alone construct new ones. Whatever money might have been allocated for the bridge got diverted to more pressing needs, food imports, military spending, or servicing debts to China. Building North Korea's half of the bridge would also require constructing highways through the territory to make the crossing useful, multiplying costs beyond anything Pyongyang could afford. There may have been political calculations too. A modern highway bridge would facilitate trade and movement between the countries, which some in the North Korean regime might see as threatening. Easier access to China means more North Koreans seeing Chinese prosperity and comparing it to conditions at home. The isolation that the incomplete bridge helps maintain might be a feature rather than a bug from Pyongyang's perspective. By 2016, Chinese officials stopped talking about when North Korea would complete their section and started calling the bridge dormant. The Chinese half sat unused except for maintenance vehicles checking the structure periodically. The $350 million China spent bought a bridge that carries zero traffic and serves zero economic purpose. The incomplete crossing became a tourist attraction in Dandong. The old bridge from the 1940s is still there, still carrying the trickle of traffic between China and North Korea that exists. But tourists drive or walk onto the new bridge to see the surreal sight. A modern 4-lane highway bridge extending halfway across the river and stopping abruptly at an invisible line in the water. Occasionally, Chinese state media run stories claiming North Korea has promised to finally build their section. Reports surface about North Korean officials pledging construction will begin, or suggestions that Chinese contractors might build the North Korean portion if payment can be arranged. These announcements never lead to actual construction. The North Korean side remains exactly as it was in 2010, empty riverbank with no development. As of 2025, the new Yalu River Bridge remains incomplete after 14 years. The Chinese section is in good condition, modern construction with proper maintenance. The cable stay tower stands against the skyline, and the bridge deck extends cleanly to the river's midpoint, where it terminates at barriers. From certain angles, it looks finished until you realize it just stops in the middle of the river with nothing on the other side. The old 1940s bridge continues carrying what little traffic moves between the countries, cramped and inadequate, but at least complete. The new bridge sits alongside it, modern and impressive and completely useless. Chinese tourists photograph it, wonder at the waste, and drive back to Dandong while the bridge waits for a North Korean half that will probably never come. While most of the blame for the incomplete Yalu River Bridge lies with China's neighbor, the world's second biggest economy is at fault for multiple cities that have stayed empty for decades. Barcelona is home to a building that, despite being one of the most visited landmarks on Earth, is still not finished. The Sagrada Familia has been under construction since 1882, even before the Eiffel Tower, and the story of why it remains unfinished is one of the strangest in architectural history. Barcelona, in the late 19th century, was in the middle of a cultural and political awakening, and one man deeply inspired by this movement was Antoni Gaudi, an architect who did not think in straight lines. He was behind the iconic designs for buildings like Casa Mila and Casa Batlló Gaudí. However, as a devout Catholic, Gaudi wanted to build something that would stand as the spiritual heart of Catalonia. His idea was a cathedral set in stone for the ages. Gaudi threw out the original neo-Gothic plans, separated from the traditional architecture, and started over. What he designed was unlike anything in the world: massive spires that looked like melting sandcastles, each dedicated to an apostle, the evangelists, the Virgin Mary, and at the center, the Tower of Jesus Christ, rising 172 meters above the city. Facades covered in stone that seemed to grow organically, like a forest frozen in time. The interior flooded with colored light from stained glass windows that Gaudi calculated to shift with the sun throughout the day. It wasn't just a church, it was a statement that architecture could be as alive as nature itself. Gaudi knew from the start he'd never see his ambition come to life. The scale was too vast, the detail too ahead of its time. But Gaudi wasn't just philosophically resigned to this, he was practically prepared for it. He spent years creating extraordinarily detailed plaster models and geometric calculations, essentially writing an instruction manual for whoever would have to carry on after him. Then, in June 1926, 3 blocks from the construction site he had dedicated his life to, Gaudi was struck by a tram. He died 3 days later. He was 73, had been living in a workshop on site for years and had given away most of his personal wealth to the project. At the time of his death, only the crypt, the apse, and one facade stood complete. Construction slowed to almost nothing, and then, a decade later, it got dramatically worse. When the Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936, anarchist militants broke into the site and burned Gaudi's workshop to the ground. His plaster models, structural drawings, and calculations, everything future builders needed to understand his intentions, were destroyed. What had been a slow project suddenly had no roadmap at all. For years after the war, there was a genuine debate about whether to continue. Respected architects argued the building should be left unfinished as a monument to Gaudi rather than risk distorting his vision with guesswork. And they had a point. Anything built from that moment forward would be interpretation, not restoration. Construction crept forward anyway through the 1950s and 60s, funded by nothing more glamorous than donation boxes and tourist ticket sales, with progress so slow it was barely visible. What finally broke the deadlock was the advent of computers. In the 1990s, architects started to digitally reconstruct Gaudi's destroyed plans by studying the geometry of what had already been built, reverse engineering his intentions from the stone itself. Suddenly, there was a real roadmap. Finally, in 2019, 137 years after the first stone was laid, the city of Barcelona issued the building's official construction permit. It had technically been illegal the entire time. The sound of cranes and construction workers started bringing Gaudi's vision to life. Today, the Tower of Jesus Christ is rising above the Barcelona skyline, and completion is expected within this decade. When it's done, it will have taken longer to build than any structure in human history, not because anyone gave up on it, but because one man's vision was so complex, so specific, and so far beyond the technology of his time that the world simply needed a century and a half to catch up. While Gaudi's dream seems to be turning into reality, we go to London, where a building born out of a tea giddy could have become Europe's tallest skyscraper. Ketchikan, Alaska has a problem that's existed since the town was founded. The airport is on the wrong island. The town sits on Revillagigedo Island with about 8,000 residents, while Ketchikan International Airport sits across the Tongass Narrows on Gravina Island, which has about 50 people. Getting between the town and its airport requires a 7-minute ferry ride that runs every half hour. Miss the ferry and you miss your flight. The ferry stops running at night, stranding late arrivals at the airport until morning. In the late 1990s, Alaska's congressional delegation proposed a solution: build a bridge connecting Ketchikan to Gravina Island. The Gravina Island Bridge would span the Tongass Narrows with a structure tall enough for cruise ships to pass underneath, requiring a bridge deck about 200 feet above the water. The bridge would be nearly as long as the Golden Gate Bridge, but serving a town of 8,000 people and an island with almost nobody on it. The bridge made some sense from Ketchikan's perspective. The ferry was inconvenient and unreliable in bad weather. Winter storms occasionally shut it down entirely, cutting the town off from its airport. A bridge would provide 24/7 access and allow future development on Gravina Island. Alaska's congressional delegation argued that Ketchikan deserved the same kind of infrastructure investment that mainland cities received. However, the estimated cost was $398 million in federal funding, requested as part of Alaska's transportation appropriations. To put that in perspective, that's roughly $50,000 per Ketchikan resident for a bridge replacing a ferry that cost $1 million annually to operate. Congressman Don Young and Senator Ted Stevens championed the project, using their powerful positions to secure funding through the 2005 federal transportation bill. Despite the funding passed, a $398 million bridge to connect 8,000 people to an island with 50 residents looked absurd to everyone outside Alaska. The media started calling it the Bridge to Nowhere, a label that stuck and transformed the project into a national symbol of wasteful government spending. Critics pointed out that you could buy every Ketchikan resident a private Learjet for less money than the bridge would cost. The political damage was done. Taxpayer advocacy groups used it in ads attacking a wasteful government. Late-night comedians made jokes about Alaska's bridge to an empty island. The question everyone asked was, at a time when we have bridges and roads crumbling around the United States, and traffic congestion worse than ever, why build a $200 million project that will serve only a few hundred people? The project became toxic. During her 2006 campaign, Sarah Palin supported the bridge, calling it essential infrastructure. However, after the national mockery intensified, she changed course and announced in 2007 that Alaska would not use state funds to complete the bridge, though she didn't return the federal money already allocated. The federal funding of $223 million that had been specifically designated for the bridge was eventually redirected to other Alaska transportation projects. Alaska kept the money and could spend it on whatever transportation projects it wanted. The bridge was never built. But strangely enough, Alaska continued building the Gravina Island Highway that connected to the bridge. The completed road is paved and well-maintained, running through forest on an island where almost nobody lives. The 3.2-mile road was supposed to connect the ferry terminal to the bridge approach, but since the bridge was never built, the road just ends at the shoreline. It's literally a road to nowhere, built at a cost of about $26 million, serving the 50 people who live on Gravina Island. The bridge to nowhere became one of the most famous infrastructure failures in American politics, despite never actually being built. It played a role in the 2008 presidential campaign, when Sarah Palin became John McCain's running mate. Her shifting positions on the bridge became a campaign issue. As of 2026, Ketchikan still takes the ferry to its airport, and the Gravina Island Highway still runs from the ferry terminal to nowhere. The road serves almost no purpose, except as a monument to the political controversy that killed the bridge. We now go to San Francisco, California, where the future of yet another mega project remains up in smoke despite costing over $8 billion. China has spent billions building fake Western cities. The country is home to a fake Paris, a fake London, and even its own Venice. However, none of those developments was planned to be as big as the Yujuapu Financial District. It is a town near Tianjin that aspired to be China's Manhattan. New York's Manhattan replicated in northern China with the same density, the same skyline, the same financial district energy that makes New York the center of global finance. The master plan for Yujiapu was breathtaking. The district would have over 30 million square feet of office space in dozens of high-rise towers designed to house international banks and financial firms. Yujiapu's skyline mimicked some of New York's most famous skyscrapers, including the Rockefeller Center and a version of the World Trade Center. Construction began in 2009 with a promised investment of $60 billion over the next 10 years, making it one of the largest urban development projects ever attempted. Tianjin officials sold this vision hard. The city would become China's northern financial center, drawing business from Beijing and competing with Shanghai's Pudong district. International banks would establish regional headquarters in Yujiapu. Domestic financial firms would relocate from Beijing to escape the capital's congestion. The district would transform Tianjin from an overlooked industrial city into a global financial hub. Construction began around 2008. Dozens of high-rises went up simultaneously across the district. An entire financial district started taking shape in what had been empty land. By 2013, the skyline transformation was complete. Yujiapu had gone from mudflats to Manhattan in less than 5 years. The towers stood finished with glass facades gleaming. The plaza was paved and landscaped. Metro stations connected the district to central Tianjin. However, it wasn't long before the money dried up as China's real estate bubble began to burst. The skyline was soaring high. However, the hope of attracting world's biggest talent and creating a financial hub out of thin air has not come to fruition. Walking through Yujiapu tells the real story. The buildings are empty. The office towers have no tenants. It was a city built for hundreds of thousands that maybe a few thousand actually inhabited. The problem was obvious. Tianjin doesn't have a financial industry. The city's economy is manufacturing, logistics, and heavy industry, not banking or investment services. International banks had no reason to establish headquarters there when Shanghai already served as China's financial center. Domestic financial firms stayed in Beijing, where regulators and government decision-makers were located. The idea that building Manhattan-style towers would somehow create a financial industry was backwards. The industry comes first, then you build the buildings to house it. The residential component failed for connected reasons. The apartments were expensive, marketed as luxury housing for the financial professionals who would work in the district's office towers. When those professionals never materialized because the financial industry never came, there was no market for expensive apartments in an empty district with no jobs, no street life, and no urban vitality. Today, the city, with its deserted wide roads and unfinished tall buildings, paints the picture of an abandoned movie set. More than 80% of China's Manhattan remains empty, and to make things worse, it is at risk of collapsing altogether to nature's forces. That's because the city is built just a few inches above sea level and is prone to flooding. Storm surges and heavy rains are common, and the few residents that still live there are looking to move out. The promise of the world's largest financial district has faded away, and what was supposed to be home to 1.2 million residents is a ghost town of less than 60,000 people. Tianjin officials insist that the district just needs time to fill up, that companies are in negotiations to relocate, and that residential sales are picking up. The government moved some of their own offices to Ujiapu to generate activity and demonstrate confidence. The occupancy numbers ticked up slightly, but remained far below the levels that would make the district viable. While Ujiapu doesn't seem apocalyptic anymore, the buildings that were ready for the banks and firms to come have been waiting for more than a decade and are likely to keep waiting for decades more. Unlike the fake Manhattan, there's a different Chinese city which managed to get rid of the ghost city tag. Construction of the Nanhui New City began in 2003 with the help of German architecture company Gherkin. Nanhui was a dream city designed around a circular artificial lake with European-styled buildings and wide roads that had distinctive pedestrian paths. The project was estimated to cost close to $5 billion and was supposed to be completed by 2020. However, the project gained little attention from the general public for almost a decade. While the city was planned for 800,000 people, less than 10% were actually living there by 2015. The malls had no stores, the office buildings' towers had no offices, and the shops had no tenants. 80% of the new properties were owned by speculators who had no intention of living there. Entire blocks of deserted housing and quiet roads welcomed visitors as they wondered about the practicality of the massive megaproject. However, it all changed around 2017 when the government decided to take over the city. They developed a university town that could house 100,000 students and then opened a metro line to connect Nanhui with Shanghai. These developments immediately turned the city into an attractive location, and people started pouring in. Soon after, Nanhui became part of the Shanghai Free Trade Zone to attract businesses. Meanwhile, a marine park was opened to increase tourism. These developments proved to be a game changer as Nanhui New City is now home to 600,000 people and can no longer be termed as a ghost city. However, the same cannot be said about some of China's insane residential projects that turned into financial disasters. In April 1992, a bomb went off in the heart of the City of London. It was planted by the IRA, and the blast was so powerful it shattered windows across the financial district, killed 3 people, and left one of London's most historic buildings, the Baltic Exchange, completely beyond repair. The site sat as a bombed-out shell for years, a scar right in the middle of one of the world's most important financial centers. Someone was going to build something there eventually. What nobody expected was just how ambitious that something would turn out to be. In September 1996, developer Trafalgar House unveiled plans for what they were calling the London Millennium Tower. They had hired Norman Foster, arguably Britain's most celebrated architect, and what he came back with was genuinely staggering. A 386-meter glass tower with 92 floors, offices, apartments, a hotel, and a public viewing platform 300 meters above the London skyline. At the time, it would have been the tallest building in Europe and the 6th tallest in the world, behind only the Petronas Towers, the Sears Tower, and the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. The estimated cost was around $550 million, roughly $1 billion in today's money. The design itself was unlike anything proposed for London before. Most skyscrapers tapered toward the top. This one didn't. It maintained its full width for almost its entire height, a massive glass monolith that would have been visible from virtually everywhere in the city. Foster's team nicknamed it the erotic gherkin, a name that immediately spread through the press and stuck around far longer than the project itself. For a brief moment, there was genuine excitement. London in the mid-1990s was reinventing itself. The financial sector was booming, the city felt ambitious, and having the tallest tower in Europe felt like a statement worth making. The project had early support from English heritage, which was itself surprising given the building's sheer scale. But almost immediately, the opposition started stacking up. English heritage reversed their position once they fully absorbed what 386 meters would actually look like against the London skyline. Their concern was St. Paul's Cathedral, Wren's masterpiece that had dominated the city's skyline for 3 centuries. The Millennium Tower wouldn't just compete with St. Paul's, it would reduce it to a footnote. The Royal Fine Art Commission called the design an over-assertive and intrusive presence, which, for a government body, is fairly close to calling something an eyesore. Then came the issue that effectively ended the whole conversation: Heathrow Airport. The tower's height would have put it directly in the flight paths of aircraft approaching one of the world's busiest airports. That wasn't a planning objection. That was a hard technical constraint with no obvious workaround. You can't negotiate a flight path. By 1997, the project was effectively dead, killed by a combination of aviation restrictions, heritage concerns, and a planning environment that simply wasn't ready for a building of that scale in that location. Not a single foundation was dug. The money spent amounted to design and planning fees. Significant, but nowhere near what would have been lost had construction actually begun. The story has an interesting twist, though. The site didn't stay empty. Trafalgar House sold it to Swiss Re, the Swiss insurance giant, who approached the same architect, Norman Foster, with a much more modest brief. What Foster designed this time was a 180-meter, 41-floor tower with a tapered, bullet-shaped profile that would famously become known as the Gherkin. The name had been coined for the Millennium Tower, but it fit the new building so perfectly that it just transferred over. The Gherkin opened in 2004 and is now one of the most recognizable buildings in London. So the site that started with a bomb almost became Europe's tallest tower and ended up with one of the city's most beloved landmarks. Speaking of beloved landmarks, we moved to a remote German town where a $4 billion megaproject was repurposed to something entirely opposite. The former naval yard located at Hunters Point was once the site of the largest U.S. facility for nuclear research. This was the location from where components of the atomic bomb, Little Boy, were loaded onto a heavy cruiser 1945. After the end of the Cold War, the shipyard was considered surplus to requirements, and the U.S. Navy decided to transform it into a residential development. The plan was to purge Hunters Point of its nuclear waste and build over 12,000 housing units, parks, and offices on it. In 2006, a company named Tetra Tech was awarded a cleanup contract worth $250 million. Tetra Tech cleared most of the land by 2012, at which point 2 different contractors started building homes on the clean land. However, while the construction continued, Tetra Tech found itself at the center of allegations related to cleanup fraud. Multiple whistleblowers who had previously worked with Tetra Tech came forward with evidence that the company had committed cleanup fraud. They had replaced hundreds of contaminated soil samples with clean ones to speed up the construction process. Tetra Tech blamed the fatal lapse on individual employees and agreed to a revised plan to get rid of the contamination. Construction continued, and by 2016, more than 200 homes had been transferred to residents who started to move in. But it wasn't long before the cleanup process came under further scrutiny. An independent review of Tetra Tech's data showed that the scale of fake testing was much greater than previously thought. In fact, almost half of the claimed cleanup work never happened. This proved to be the final straw for the ambitious development, which was immediately put on hold. More than $1 billion had already been spent on the project at this point. But the even bigger issue was the blatant disregard of public health. More than 300 units had already been transferred to buyers for $1 million each, despite a disastrous cleanup effort. It was later found that Tetra Tech wasn't the only one at fault. A 2018 review by the EPA found that the Navy had also understated the enormity of the contamination. Predictably enough, dozens of lawsuits followed. The homeowners collectively sued the developers, who then sued Tetra Tech, who then shifted blame to the US Navy and even took the EPA to court, citing a lack of evidence. These lawsuits totaled up to $30 billion. However, in the last 5 years, only a few $1 million have been paid to the victims, with the prosecutors failing to settle on an acceptable number. Developers claim that the shipyard project can still become a reality as a new cleanup effort is underway. However, it may not be as straightforward because the contamination issue has become even bigger than in the past. That's according to a San Francisco grand jury findings of 2022 that labeled the previous cleanups useless. That's because the rising groundwater over the last decade has almost certainly given new life to previously dormant radioactive contaminants. This means that the whole thing might have to be built from scratch and may need tens of billions of dollars. Till then, the project's future remains up in smoke, and it is more than likely that the mega project may soon be deemed unfeasible, with billions going to waste. We now move to South Carolina, to another nuclear station, which could not keep up with its lofty promises. China's Hebei province has a population of 75 million. 11 million of these people live in the city of Shijiazhuang, where a property developer proposed a city within a city. The Xiang Yun International Project was to be developed at a cost of $3 billion. It had everything: a high-end residential community, apartment buildings, theme parks, and skyscrapers. Built right next to a metro network and a major high-speed rail station, this was not an isolated location by any means. It is also why the project gained immediate success after construction began in 2009. More than 700 housing units were sold in the first 2 years, and there was no shortage of clients for the apartment buildings. However, everything came crashing down in 2014 when the developers behind the project were put under investigation on corruption charges. Those charges were proven right in 2017, resulting in jail sentences. The developer declared bankruptcy soon after, crashing the property prices and leaving the project unfinished. The Xiang Yun International Project is still surrounded by a bustling city. However, inside the premises is a completely different story. Thousands of homeowners have failed to move in after the government took over the project, turning the project into a ghost town. With dreams of a new metropolis fading, the location has turned into a tourist attraction and is frequently visited by vloggers trying to cash in on a deserted film set. Something similar happened at a project only known as the State Guest Mansions. In 2010, a Shanghai-based real estate developer called the Greenland Group tried building a small town in the hills of Shenyang, about 400 miles northeast of Beijing. The plan was to build 260 extravagant mansions for the high society, a 5-star hotel, a convention center, and a golf course. Construction began with optimism, and the mansions found steady customers. But like many of China's real estate developers in recent years, the Greenland Group defaulted on its debts just 36 months after construction began. Just 5% of the mansions were sold at that point, and no further development has occurred since. The rows of unfinished mansions seem haunted from afar, as they are left to rot in a remote area. The only visitors are herds of cattle and the local farmers who have now begun to reclaim their land. The lines between the villas are now being used for future crops, and the deserted garages are now storage facilities for the farmers. Dust covers the expensive furnishings of the incomplete houses, while the chandeliers and paintings remain untouched. There is no official news on what the future holds for the development that was supposed to be a playground for the rich. As with many other abandoned cities, the mansions are now a popular destination for those seeking adventure. Talking of adventure, we move to a mega project that imitated the luxury of the Middle East, but turned into a white elephant when economic realities hit. A few kilometers from the Dutch border lies the small German town of Kalkar that is home to an impressive amusement park. Roller coasters, a Ferris wheel, go-kart tracks, a 437-room hotel, and at the center of it all, a giant cooling tower with a swing ride built inside it. Families drive from all over Europe to visit. However, almost none of them fully appreciate what they're actually standing in. A $4 billion nuclear power plant that was completed, fully built, and never switched on even once. The story starts in 1972, when West Germany had a problem. The country was heavily dependent on energy imports, and with global oil prices spiraling out of control after the 1973 oil crisis, the government was desperate to find a way to generate power domestically. Nuclear energy was the obvious answer, and Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands jointly commissioned the construction of a fast breeder reactor near Kalkar, a cutting-edge design that could theoretically generate more fuel than it consumed, running on plutonium. It was genuinely revolutionary technology, and the three governments were convinced they were building the future. Construction began in 1972, and the trouble started almost immediately. A fast breeder reactor is extraordinarily complex. It's cooled by liquid sodium, which reacts violently with both air and water, meaning every single system has to be engineered to a level of precision well beyond a conventional nuclear plant. Every delay triggered a redesign, and every redesign triggered another delay. What was supposed to be a straightforward project dragged on for over a decade, and costs that began at a few $100 million Deutsche Mark ballooned to $7 billion, roughly $4 billion, enough to have built 20,000 family homes. Meanwhile, the public was growing increasingly nervous. In 1977, 5 years into construction, around 40,000 protesters marched through the streets of Kalkar. Then in 1979, 3 Mile Island happened, a partial meltdown at a nuclear plant in Pennsylvania that terrified the world and brought anti-nuclear sentiment in Germany to a fever pitch. Construction was halted for 4 years while safety commissions reviewed the entire design. More upgrades, more costs, more delays. By 1985, the plant was finally complete. The sodium coolant was already running through the system, kept hot at enormous expense so it wouldn't solidify in the pipes. The reactor was fully ready to receive nuclear fuel. And then, 1 year later, Chernobyl happened. The explosion at the Soviet reactor in April 1986 changed everything. The images of evacuation convoys, contaminated farmland, and a city abandoned overnight hit Europe with the force of a shockwave. Germany, which had already been uneasy about nuclear power, turned decisively against it. The state government of North Rhine-Westphalia, which had authority over nuclear licensing, refused to issue the operating permit. The federal government, with elections approaching, chose not to push the issue. The plant sat there, fully built, fully functional in every technical sense, costing over 5 million euros per month just to maintain in standby mode, and going absolutely nowhere. For 6 years, it just sat there. The sodium kept being heated. The maintenance crews kept showing up. The bills kept coming. Finally, in 1991, the project was officially canceled. The valuable components stripped out and sold off, and the site put up for auction. It sold for 2.5 million euros, a fraction of a percent of what it had cost to build. The man who bought it was a Dutch entrepreneur named Henny van der Most, and his plan for the site was the opposite of what it was originally meant for. He turned it into an amusement park. The reactor building became a hotel. The cooling tower, that great hulking concrete monument to a power plant that never generated a single watt, was painted to look like a snowy mountain and fitted with a swing ride inside. The park opened in 2001 under the name Wonderland Kalkar and now draws around 600,000 visitors every year. There's something almost poetic about it. Germany spent $4 billion, 13 years, and enormous political capital building a machine designed to power a nation. And what it ended up powering was a merry-go-round. From Germany's abandoned nuclear plant in a remote town, we moved to a Greek village which could have been the location for the continent's tallest dam. Construction on South Carolina's VC Summer Nuclear Station began in 1973. 11 years later, Unit 1 reactor was ready for commercial operations, and it was an instant success. The plant cost $1.3 billion to construct, 24% less than the average of 13 nuclear plants constructed over the same time period. By 2004, the Unit 1 was going strong. However, power demand was rising across the state. Encouraged by the Unit 1 success, the state-owned South Carolina Power Company decided to expand the facilities with 2 new power plants that would serve consumers for another 60 years. However, the story of the new megaproject became a chronicle of failure. The plan was to add 2 Westinghouse AP1000 reactors that would be safer, simpler, and supposedly faster to build than previous reactor generations. The modular construction approach meant major components could be fabricated off-site and assembled on location, dramatically reducing construction time and costs compared to older nuclear plants that were essentially custom-built. The projected cost was $9.8 billion for both reactors, with completion in 2016 and 2019. The question was who was going to pay for it. On April 19, 2007, South Carolina's legislature passed a law allowing utilities to charge customers for construction costs before the plants opened. They aimed to spread the financial burden over years rather than hitting ratepayers with massive increases at once when the reactors went online. Construction began in 2013 with massive excitement. This would be the first new nuclear construction in the US in 30 years. It would bring thousands of jobs and secure the state's energy future for generations. However, the problems started almost immediately, but were hidden from public view. Westinghouse's partner, Chicago Bridge and Iron, was building the modules but struggling with quality control and the complexity of nuclear-grade construction. The modules that were supposed to arrive ready for assembly showed up incomplete or poorly fabricated, driving up the costs while delaying the project further. Westinghouse, the company that was also providing nuclear reactors for the Vogtle nuclear plant expansion in Georgia, was under immense pressure. The Vogtle expansion project had been facing significant delays and was almost twice over budget. On March 29, 2017, Westinghouse filed for bankruptcy. That made it clear that the contractor would not be able to fulfill the $3.3 billion contract for summer, leading to further cost increases. By 2017, the estimated cost of the project had risen to over $12 billion, more than 75% over the original budget. Moreover, it would not be finished until 2024, meaning that the consumers were left to pay billions more and wait a decade before reaping any benefits. Santee Cooper pulled the plug on the project by the end of 2017 after failing to find any new investors. Other partners followed lead and filed for bankruptcies because of the financial fallout from the project. Despite the abandonment, more than 700,000 South Carolina utility customers kept seeing charges related to the project on their monthly electric bills. The political fallout was immediate and brutal. South Carolina customers had been paying higher electric bills for years to fund construction of reactors that would now never generate a single watt of power. The revelations that executives knew the project was failing but lied about it triggered criminal investigations. In 2018, federal prosecutors charged former SCANA CEO Kevin Marsh and other executives with fraud for lying to investors and regulators about the project's true status. The Nukegate scandal, as it became known, destroyed SCANA's reputation and led to the company being acquired by Dominion Energy in a fire sale deal designed to protect ratepayers. Santee Cooper, the state-owned partner, faced its own investigations and leadership changes. The VC Summer site remains a working nuclear facility. Unit 1, built in the 1980s, continues operating successfully, but next to it stand the hulking concrete shells of Units 2 and 3, $9 billion worth of unfinished construction, slowly weathering in the South Carolina humidity. Through all the gloom, there now appears to be a silver lining for the abandoned site. Santee Cooper says it is considering reviving the project because of rising power demand, and it is looking for someone to own and operate the plant. Since the power plant is already partially built, the state enterprise is hopeful that it could be completed quickly. South Carolina state government officials have already investigated the site and found it to be in decent condition despite some surface rust. There are also encouraging signs as other left-for-dead nuclear projects, like the 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, are being revived to power data centers. However, there is no progress yet on this revival plan. For now, the reactors that were supposed to power the state for 60 years stand as a reminder of a colossal $9 billion failure. But if you think $9 billion was a huge waste, wait till you learn about the next megaproject on our list. China is famous for its mega tunnels, new cities, and enormous dams. But this was different. In 2012, the rapidly growing Evergrande group decided to build something to rival mega developments in Dubai. Off the coast of Danzhou, in southern Hainan province, they were building the world's largest man-made island. The Ocean Flower Island is a cluster of 3 artificial islands, shaped like a flower from above, and 1.5 times the size of Palm Jumeirah, which is why it was nicknamed the Dubai of China. Sprawling over 2,000 acres and with a construction cost of $12 billion, it was planned to be the hub of tourism, international conferences, and leisure. However, it wasn't long before its artificial beaches became too dangerous to swim and its luxury villas turned into rubble. So how did that happen? The rationale behind such extravagant spending was the same as many other Chinese vanity projects: to build first and attract visitors later. Optimism around the project was high, and the builders were betting big. They believed the island would attract millions of visitors every year, and the architecture reflected that optimism. Evergrande built the Castle, a hotel with over 5,000 rooms and 2 outdoor swimming pools. There was a dedicated shopping destination accessed by streets featuring Italian, German, and Chinese architecture straight out of a movie set. Then there's a plaza surrounded by 8 fake churches, including a red brick cathedral that was supposed to attract wedding shows and travelers' documentaries. However, these investments fell short of what Evergrande truly wanted to build: a $23 billion spending on apartment complexes to house 200,000 residents. 400 apartment buildings were developed over the next few years, with 60,000 housing units sold. There was initial interest with long lines of buyers outside Evergrande offices. However, then came the crash. Evergrande collapsed under more than $300 billion of debt in 2021. More than 1,300 megaprojects across the country were left in limbo, but perhaps nowhere else was the impact as visible as the Ocean Flower Island. The man behind the project was Xiang Yun, Evergrande's founder and former chairman, who was once China's richest man and is now in jail. While he is said to have designed every detail at the island, he could not figure out how the project would make enough money to complete the fake islands and to pay back the investors. Unlike Palm Island in Dubai, where the grand villas were sold quickly to celebrities, soccer stars, and foreign officials, Ocean Flower Island could only attract retirees from northern China looking for a warm place to winter, ensuring that there was no community to populate the island. There were further charges of corruption, with former Danzhou government officials accused of signing off on a venture that violated environmental protection laws. Local officials, including the former governor and party secretary of Hainan, were jailed for up to 15 years for taking around $16 million in bribes. Predictably, the construction has completely stopped and the Flower Island looks like a deserted wreckage. The Castle Hotel is surrounded by dozens of unfinished villas. Its luxury pools have been drained of water and remain empty most of the year. The model churches sit forgotten, illuminated occasionally for a sound and light show. All that's left of the development is a gigantic shopping mall without shops, an amusement park with no visitors, and abandoned high-rise housing blocks throughout. Dozens of buildings never went beyond their concrete foundations, which are now flooded by rainwater. 39 high-rise apartment blocks that were nearly finished now stand there in search of buyers. There are no reliable estimates of the current population, beyond the thousands of people who initially purchased properties, way behind the early projections. After the collapse of Evergrande, the municipal government of Danzhou now controls much of Ocean Flower Island. Despite continuous efforts, it is struggling to figure out what to do with it. The $12 billion wreckage has no takers and it is too big to clear away quickly. After all that has transpired, Ocean Flower still has believers. With retirees flocking to the sunny heavens, the island has a way out. Close to 300 million Chinese people are retiring over the next decade, and if a fraction of those decide to move here, this could take the path of former ghost cities that turned into success stories. For now, there's no optimism. What was supposed to be China's biggest built-from-scratch entertainment destination, further away from China and much more expensive. In the village of Mesochora, high in the mountains of central Greece, there's a cafe with a red line painted on its wall. Next to the line, someone has written the number 785. That's the altitude in meters, the point at which the water would rise if the dam just outside the village were ever filled. The cafe sits below that line. So does the post office, the church, and about a third of the houses in the village. For nearly 40 years, the people of Mesochora have been living under the threat of being swallowed by a reservoir that still hasn't arrived. And the dam causing all of this? It's been sitting there, fully built, for over 2 decades, and not a single drop of water has ever been held behind it. The idea behind the project goes back to the 1930s, when Greek engineers first looked at the Yalu River, the second longest in the country, and saw potential. The river ran through the mountains of western Greece, carrying enormous volumes of water all the way to the Ionian Sea. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pindus mountain range, the vast agricultural plains of Thessaly were chronically short of water, relying on shrinking groundwater supplies to irrigate their cotton and wheat fields. The solution seemed obvious: divert the Yalu through a tunnel under the mountains and redirect its water eastward to Thessaly. Build a series of dams, generate hydroelectric power along the way, and solve 2 problems at once. The Greek government revived the idea in 1984, and construction began at Mesochora 2 years later. The dam itself was an enormous undertaking, 150 meters tall, built into the steep walls of a mountain gorge, with enough capacity to power a 162-megawatt hydroelectric plant. But almost from the beginning, the project ran into resistance. Local residents, who had never been properly consulted, suddenly discovered that 2/3 of their village would be submerged once the reservoir filled. Environmental groups pointed out that diverting the Yalu would devastate the river's delta on the Ionian coast, a protected wetland home to flamingos, pelicans, sea eagles, and over 30,000 animal species. And Greece's own Supreme Court kept intervening, repeatedly freezing construction after ruling that the environmental impact studies were inadequate. Work stalled, restarted, stalled again. By 2001, the dam structure itself was technically complete, but the reservoir had never been filled, the power plant had never been commissioned, and the legal battles showed no signs of ending. The government tried bypassing the courts with new legislation in 2006, only to face fresh challenges from the European Court of Justice. By 2010, work had stopped again. The dam just sat there in the gorge, enormous and useless, slowly developing cracks in its wall before it had ever held a drop of water. Meanwhile, the village of Mesochora existed in a kind of suspended limbo. Families had been living for years with compulsory purchase orders hanging over their homes, not knowing whether to invest in their properties or prepare to leave. Many simply left anyway, not waiting to find out. A village that once had a full community gradually hollowed out, its population dwindling as younger generations moved to the cities, rather than wait indefinitely for a future that kept getting postponed. On the wall of the town hall, someone hung a sign that read, "Mesochora will live." It was hard to know whether it was defiance or a question. The total cost of the project by this point had exceeded 300 million euros, worth closer to 500 million in today's money, and all of it spent on a structure that had generated not a single watt of electricity. Then, at the end of 2025, something shifted. The Greek government designated the Mesochora plant a project of national economic importance and signed a new agreement with the state power company to finally complete it. Studies for relocating the remaining residents were commissioned, with the government promising full compensation for all affected households. For the first time in decades, there appeared to be genuine political will to end the stalemate. Whether that actually happens remains to be seen. The Mesochora Dam has been almost finished, almost cancelled, almost revived so many times that the people living in its shadow have long since stopped trusting announcements. The red line on the cafe wall is still there, and so is the cafe for now. Next up, we have a different kind of Greek village that once brought the country immense prestige but couldn't sustain its legacy. California in 2008 faced a problem that had been getting worse for decades. The state's 3 major population centers were choking on their own growth. Los Angeles, the San Francisco Bay Area, and San Diego were sprawling outward. Highways were congested beyond capacity, and flying between cities meant dealing with airports that were operating at their limits. Driving from LA to San Francisco took 6 hours minimum in good traffic, often much longer. Flying took an hour in the air, but 3 hours door-to-door with airport security and connections. The solution seemed obvious: build what Europe and Japan had proven worked: high-speed rail. Trains traveling at 220 miles per hour could connect San Francisco and Los Angeles in under 3 hours. The California high-speed rail system would revolutionize travel in America's most populous state, taking cars off freeways and planes out of the sky while providing clean electric transportation for 40 million Californians. The total cost was estimated at $33 billion, with completion targeted for 2020. Federal funding would cover part of the cost, and private investors would supposedly finance much of the rest once the system proved viable. Voters approved the project in November 200, authorizing $9 billion in bonds to start construction. The plan called for 520 miles of dedicated high-speed track running through the Central Valley, then splitting to serve both San Francisco and Los Angeles. Trains would stop in Sacramento, Fresno, Bakersfield, and other cities along the route. The system would eventually extend to San Diego, creating a network serving the entire state. Readership projections suggested 117 million passengers annually by 2030, enough to make the system sustainable through ticket sales. Construction was supposed to start quickly, with the first section opening by 2020 and the full SFLA route operational by 2028. The Obama administration awarded California $3.5 billion in federal stimulus funding in 2010, and the state began preliminary work. That's when reality started diverging from the vision. The environmental review process revealed problems that resulted in construction delays. The route passed through areas with endangered species, went near earthquake faults that required expensive engineering solutions, and crossed hundreds of properties that would need to be acquired. Every landowner fought acquisition, every environmental group demanded modifications, and every city along the route insisted on stations and design changes. What was supposed to be a streamlined approval process turned into years of lawsuits and negotiations. The cost estimates started climbing immediately. By 2012, the projected cost had reached $68 billion. By 2014, it was $77 billion. The timeline slipped to the late 2000s, then the early 2000s. The California High-Speed Rail Authority kept insisting the project was on track while simultaneously announcing delays and cost increases. Each revised business plan showed higher costs, longer timelines, and lower ridership projections. The route planning became politically impossible. Different cities demanded different routes, and California's environmental review laws gave opponents multiple ways to delay or block progress. By 2016, not a single mile of track had been laid, despite spending over $5 billion on planning, environmental reviews, land acquisition, and preliminary construction. Critics started calling it a train to nowhere, echoing the bridge to nowhere controversy. The project became politically toxic. Republicans opposed it as wasteful spending, and even some Democrats questioned whether California could actually build it. The authority pivoted to a new strategy in 2017: build the Central Valley section first. The 119-mile segment from Madera to Bakersfield would be the initial operating segment, proving the system worked and generating revenue while the rest of the route was completed later. Construction in the Central Valley began in 2015 and continues as of 2025. Though progress has been slower than projected, viaducts are under construction, land is being graded for track, and some structures are complete. But the work is years behind schedule and billions over budget. The Central Valley section alone is now estimated to cost $35 billion, more than the entire system was supposed to cost in 2008. The San Francisco-LA vision has essentially died. Current cost estimates for completing the full system exceed $100 billion, with some analyses suggesting $128 billion or more. The timeline has been pushed to the 2040s or beyond, so far in the future that it's effectively meaningless. The California High-Speed Rail Authority no longer seriously claims the full system will be built as originally envisioned. The project has spent over $11 billion through 2024, with most of that going to land acquisition, environmental mitigation, and preliminary construction in the Central Valley. Not a single mile of operational track exists. The earliest the Merced-Bakersfield section might open is 2030 to 2033. Though those dates have already slipped multiple times and will likely slip again, California high-speed rail hasn't been officially abandoned, but it's abandoned in the sense that the original vision is dead. The system voters approved SF to LA in under 3 hours for $33 billion by 2020 will never be built. What might eventually exist is a scaled-back Central Valley rail line that cost 3 times what the entire system was supposed to cost, serves a fraction of the intended destinations, and took decades longer than promised. The trains that were supposed to revolutionize California transportation remain hypothetical, existing only in renderings and promises. The track that voters approved in 2008 is still years away from carrying a single passenger. In 2025, the Trump administration announced cancellation of federal funding for the project, essentially stopping it altogether. What the California residents might eventually get is a hugely scaled-down version with no known timeline or cost estimate. California high-speed rail suffered from crippling administrative delays and the project turning into a political tool, similar to another megaproject that wasted billions in the 90s and was eventually abandoned altogether. When Athens won the right to host the 2004 Summer Olympics, it felt like a homecoming. The modern Olympic Games had been born in Athens in 1896, and 108 years later, the world's greatest sporting event was returning to where it all started. Greece threw itself into the preparations with enormous national pride and enormous amounts of money. What followed was one of the most celebrated Olympics in recent memory and one of the most catastrophic sporting legacies in history. The scale of construction was staggering. Greece built or completely renovated 37 competition venues across the city, including a main Olympic stadium with an iconic glass and steel roof designed by Santiago Calatrava. There was an aquatic center, a velodrome, a beach volleyball arena on the coast, stadiums for hockey, baseball and softball, and an Olympic village large enough to house 16,000 athletes. Alongside the venues, the city built a new international airport, expanded the metro system, laid new tram lines, and constructed a ring motorway around the city. The official cost, according to the Greek Finance Ministry, came to $9 billion. Some economists put the real figure closer to $14 billion. The preparations were a nightmare. Of the 7 years Greece had been given to get ready, 4 were largely swallowed up by planning changes, personnel reshuffles, legal disputes, and what later became the subject of corruption trials over inflated construction contracts. With just weeks to go before the opening ceremony, several venues were still unfinished. Workers were pulling double and overnight shifts to get things done in time. At least 14 people died during the construction process. The main stadium was completed just 2 months before the Games opened. And then the Olympics happened, and for 2 weeks, it was genuinely magnificent. Athens delivered a spectacular event. Warm, dramatic, deeply felt. The opening ceremony was widely praised. The athletics were thrilling. The city buzzed. For Greece, it was a moment of immense national pride, and the world watched. Then the flame went out, and reality set in. The Greek government had spent billions building world-class facilities, but had made almost no concrete plans for what to do with them afterward. The softball stadium stood empty because nobody in Greece played softball. The hockey center never hosted another match after the closing ceremony. The velodrome and aquatic center were locked and left to deteriorate. Weeds pushed through the stands. Graffiti spread across the walls. The beach volleyball arena on the Athens coast, once packed with 10,000 cheering spectators, became one of the most photographed symbols of post-Olympic decay in the world, a rusting skeleton sitting beside the sea. When Greece's debt crisis exploded in 2010, the abandoned venues shifted from an embarrassment to something more serious. The country was being asked to accept brutal austerity measures while billions of euros worth of sports facilities sat rotting in the sun. The IOC's own chairman at the time estimated that the Games may have contributed 2 to 3% of Greece's catastrophic external debt. Greek athletes, meanwhile, were training abroad because the facilities at home had become too dangerous to use. Some equipment was so outdated that coaches feared it would cause injuries. The company set up to manage the Olympic properties, Hellenic Olympic properties, struggled for years to attract investors. The Olympic Village, built to house thousands of athletes, gradually became a ghost town on the outskirts of the city. Slowly, some venues found second lives. The shooting center became a police training facility. A taekwondo hall was converted into a theater. The aquatic center eventually reopened, and the large Hellenico coastal complex has been earmarked for a major private redevelopment project with plans for a park, residential buildings, and a casino. Some of the abandoned stadiums there have already been demolished to make way for it. It's now 20 years since the Athens Olympics. The infrastructure built for the games, the airport, the metro, the motorways, still serves the city every day. But the sporting venues tell a different story. What happens when a country spends everything it has on a 2-week party and then wakes up the morning after? Speaking of parties, we go to a European ghost town that was once the continent's biggest tourist destination. In 1987, physicists convinced the US government to fund the most ambitious scientific experiment ever attempted on American soil. The Superconducting Super Collider would be a particle accelerator so powerful it would dwarf every other physics facility in the world, smashing protons together at energies high enough to reveal the fundamental structure of reality. The SSC would discover the Higgs boson, unlock mysteries of dark matter, and establish American dominance in particle physics for the next 50 years. The design called for a circular tunnel 87 kilometers in circumference, buried 30 meters underground in the Texas countryside near Waxahachie, about 30 miles south of Dallas. That's 3 times larger than Europe's Large Hadron Collider, big enough that the curvature of the tunnel would be barely noticeable to someone standing inside. Superconducting magnets would accelerate protons to 99.9999% the speed of light, then smash them together with 20 times more energy than any previous collider could achieve. The project's champions included top physicists who argued that fundamental science required this scale of investment. Understanding how the universe works at its most basic level, what gives particles mass, what dark matter is made of, whether there are extra dimensions, demanded energies the SSC could provide. Europe was building the LHC. That would be a smaller, weaker machine. The SSC would be the undisputed king of particle physics, and America would own it. Congress authorized the project in 1987 with an estimated cost of $4.4 billion and completion targeted for the mid-1990s. After evaluating proposals from multiple states, the Department of Energy selected Texas in 1988. The Dallas area offered flat terrain with stable geology and good infrastructure for supporting a massive construction project. Construction began in 1991. Workers started boring tunnels through the Austin Chalk Formation underlying the Texas prairie. The tunnel boring machines excavated circular passages 10 feet in diameter, and workers installed concrete lining to prevent collapse. The excavation progressed simultaneously from multiple access shafts, with crews working around the clock to dig out what would become the world's largest scientific instrument. By 1993, about 23 kilometers of tunnel were complete, roughly a quarter of the 87-kilometer ring. 2 massive experimental halls had been excavated where particle detectors would be installed. Campus buildings were under construction to house physicists and equipment. Hundreds of superconducting magnets had been manufactured and were being tested. Hundreds of superconducting magnets had been manufactured and were being tested. The project employed thousands of workers and seemed to be progressing toward its goal of operations beginning in 1999. But costs were spiraling. The $4.4 billion estimate from 1987 looked absurdly optimistic by 1992. New cost projections reached $8 billion, then $10 billion, then $12 billion as the technical challenges of building such an enormous facility became clear. Every kilometer of tunnel cost more than estimated. The superconducting magnets were harder to manufacture reliably than expected. The experimental detectors required custom engineering that consumed budgets. The timeline slipped from 1999 to the early 2000s. Congress started questioning why American taxpayers should fund this. The Cold War had ended, and the Soviet Union was no longer a scientific competitor requiring American dominance in particle physics. The federal deficit was growing, and domestic programs needed funding. Spending $12 billion to find exotic particles seemed hard to justify when infrastructure was crumbling and social programs were being cut. Physicists fought hard for the SSC. They testified before Congress explaining how the project would advance human knowledge and maintain American scientific leadership. However, the politics turned brutal through 1992 and 1993. The House of Representatives voted to cancel the SSC in June 1992, but the Senate restored funding. The battle repeated in 1993, with both chambers voting multiple times on whether to continue. Each vote was close, with margins of just a few votes determining whether the project lived or died. SSC supporters needed every vote, while opponents only needed to win once to kill the project permanently. On October 21, 1993, the House of Representatives voted 282 to 143 to terminate the superconducting super collider. The Senate didn't override the decision, and the project was officially dead. About $2 billion had been spent, with 23 kilometers of tunnel excavated, experimental halls dug, buildings constructed, and thousands of magnets manufactured. All of it became instantly worthless when Congress pulled the funding. The equipment was sold off in auctions. Superconducting magnets that cost millions to develop were sold for scrap value. Sophisticated instruments were bought by other labs for pennies on the dollar. The tunnel boring machines were sold to other projects. The experimental detector components were scrapped or repurposed. $2 billion of investment generated maybe $200 million in salvage value. The tunnels were simply abandoned. 23 kilometers of concrete-lined tunnels sat empty underground near Waxahachie. Without pumping, groundwater gradually flooded the lower sections. The access shafts were sealed, and the surface buildings were demolished or repurposed. The massive experimental halls, excavated spaces large enough to hold multi-story buildings, slowly filled with water. Today, the tunnels are still there, flooded and inaccessible, buried under Texas farmland. The surface shows almost no evidence the SSC ever existed. Some buildings were sold to private companies or the county government. The Superconducting Super Collider represents the most expensive scientific project ever abandoned. The $2 billion spent, roughly $4 billion in today's money, bought 23 kilometers of flooded tunnel, some buildings that got repurposed, and a lesson about the limits of American commitment to pure science. From a physics experiment that could not pass through Congress, we go to our final megaproject, another multi-billion-dollar plan that died at the hands of the American Parliament. In the early 1970s, Varosha, a beachfront district on the eastern coast of Cyprus, had become one of the most sought-after destinations in Europe. The hotels were modern, the beaches were spectacular, and the whole place hummed with the energy of a resort at the height of its powers. In 1974, it was the #1 tourist destination in Cyprus, and investment was still pouring in. New hotels were under construction. The future looked bright. Then, on the morning of August 14, 1974, the Turkish military advanced on Famagusta. What happened next has its roots in decades of tension between the Greek and Turkish communities in Cyprus. The island had been a powder keg for years, and when a Greek military-backed coup tried to force the unification of Cyprus with Greece, Turkey sent 40,000 troops to the island, citing its right to protect the Turkish Cypriot minority. Within days, Turkish forces had taken control of roughly a third of the island. As they approached Famagusta, the Greek Cypriot residents of Varosha grabbed what they could carry and fled south, fully expecting to return in a few days once things calmed down. Many left their front doors unlocked. Cars sat in driveways. Shops had stock on the shelves. Building sites still had scaffolding up. However, they never came back. The Turkish military fenced off the entire district, strung barbed wire around its perimeter, and declared it a closed military zone. Their calculation was strategic. Varosha was too valuable to simply hand back. It would serve as a bargaining chip, something to trade in future peace negotiations in exchange for political concessions. So the fence went up, the gates closed, and an entire functioning resort town was simply left to stand empty and decay. For the next 50 years, nature slowly took over. Weeds pushed up through the roads. The hotels that had once hosted European celebrities stood silent, their facades crumbling, their pools dry. their lobbies filled with the debris of decades. The grand buildings that had once been symbols of Mediterranean glamour became some of the most haunting images of abandoned architecture in the world. All of it sitting behind a wire fence, untouched, just a few hundred meters from ordinary daily life in Famagusta. The United Nations repeatedly called for Varosha to be returned to its inhabitants. UN Security Council Resolution 550 explicitly stated that settling any part of it by people other than its original residents was inadmissible. Peace negotiations came and went. The Annan Plan of 2004 would have returned Varosha to Greek Cypriot control, but it was rejected in a referendum. The bargaining chip remained exactly where it had been, behind the wire, getting older and more decrepit with every passing year. Then, in 2020, the government of Northern Cyprus announced a partial reopening of Varosha. A small section of the beachfront was open to visitors. Turkey's President Erdogan visited in person to mark the occasion. For the original residents, many of them now elderly, some of them having spent 50 years dreaming of going home, the partial reopening felt less like progress and more like a door being quietly closed forever. Walking through the reopened streets today, you can still see the war damage from 1974 on the sides of buildings. Signs warn visitors to stay back from structures that could collapse at any moment. The hotels are beyond saving. Most of what was there in 1974 is now too far gone to restore. Varosha spent 50 years as a ghost town, not because of financial failure or engineering problems or political indifference, but because two sides in a conflict each decided it was more useful as a pawn than as a home. From ghost towns, we move on to ghost airports and take a closer look at the world's biggest abandoned airport. The southern tip of Malaysia sits just across a narrow strait from Singapore, close enough that on clear days you can see Singapore's skyscrapers from the Malaysian shore. For decades, this proximity tortured Malaysian developers who watched Singapore's property values soar while Malaysian land remained cheap. The dream was obvious: build something on the Malaysian side that could capture some of Singapore's wealth, creating housing for people who worked in Singapore but couldn't afford Singapore prices. In 2006, Chinese property giant Country Garden proposed doing this at a scale never attempted in a different country. Forest City would be built on 4 artificial islands totaling 14 square kilometers off the coast of Johor. The development would house 700,000 people in high-rise apartments, provide 1 million square meters of commercial space, and feature hotels, schools, hospitals, and entertainment facilities. The master plan showed a futuristic eco-city with vertical gardens, green spaces integrated into buildings, and sustainable design throughout. Total investment would reach $100 billion over 20 to 30 years, making it one of the largest property developments ever conceived. Country Garden marketed Forest City aggressively to Chinese buyers. The pitch was compelling. Buy an apartment in a tropical paradise near Singapore, enjoy permanent residency benefits in Malaysia, and watch your investment appreciate as the development is filled with residents. Chinese buyers could escape pollution and crowding at home while parking money in overseas real estate. The Malaysian government also supported the project, seeing it as a massive foreign investment that would develop Johor and create jobs. Construction began in 2014 on reclaiming land from the sea. Dredgers worked around the clock, pumping sand from the seabed to build up the artificial islands. The scale of land reclamation was enormous. Creating 14 square kilometers of new land required moving millions of cubic meters of sand and rock. By 2016, the first island was complete and construction of residential towers began. Country Garden built fast. Within 2 years, dozens of high-rise towers were under construction simultaneously. The first completed buildings opened for occupancy in 2016, and Country Garden claimed strong sales to Chinese buyers. The company reported selling thousands of units and generating billions in revenue. Visitors to Forest City saw a massive construction site with cranes everywhere and towers rising across the reclaimed islands. But cracks were appearing even as construction accelerated. The Malaysian government began questioning the project as locals complained that Forest City primarily benefited Chinese buyers while doing little for Malaysians. In 2018, Malaysia's new government imposed restrictions on foreign ownership and canceled visa programs that had attracted Chinese buyers. The message was clear. Malaysia didn't want to become a real estate colony for Chinese investors. Chinese buyers who'd purchased apartments started having second thoughts. Forest City was promoted as near Singapore. Nobody actually needed to live in Forest City unless they worked in nearby Johor. And Johor didn't have enough employment to justify housing 700,000 people. The whole concept depended on people choosing to live there for lifestyle reasons or as an investment, not because they needed to be there. Chinese property buyers started defaulting on purchases as China's property market weakened, and capital controls made it harder to move money overseas. Country Garden had sold apartments that buyers couldn't or wouldn't complete payment on. Meanwhile, completed apartments sat empty because the buyers who did complete purchases often didn't actually move in. They'd bought as investments, not as homes to occupy. By 2019, Forest City's failure was becoming obvious. The company claimed 15,000 residents, but independent observers estimated actual occupancy at maybe 5,000. The completed towers were largely dark at night. The retail spaces had almost no tenants. The hotels had few guests. Walking through Forest City felt surreal. Brand new apartment towers, immaculate infrastructure, beautiful landscaping, and almost no people. Country Garden kept building because stopping would mean admitting failure and writing off billions in investment. More towers went up even as earlier towers sat empty. The company kept marketing to Chinese buyers even as sales collapsed. Construction workers outnumbered residents by a significant margin. The COVID pandemic devastated what little momentum remained. Travel restrictions prevented Chinese buyers from visiting. Malaysia's economy weakened, making local sales even harder. Country Garden itself ran into severe financial problems in China as the country's property bubble burst. By 2023, Country Garden was effectively bankrupt, defaulting on billions in bonds and unable to fund ongoing projects. As of 2025, Forest City stands as one of the world's largest ghost cities. 4 artificial islands covered with high-rise towers that are less than 10% occupied. Thousands of completed apartments sit empty and deteriorating. Retail centers have almost no stores. Streets are empty except for occasional security patrols and the few thousand residents who actually live there for reasons that remain mysterious. The empty units are slowly degrading without climate control in Malaysia's humid tropical environment. The ambitious, sustainable design features like vertical gardens require maintenance that isn't happening in empty buildings, so the greenery is dying or being removed. Drone footage of Forest City is haunting. Island after island of high-rise towers extending into the distance. Lights visible in maybe one window out of 20. Streets without traffic, parks without people. It looks like a city evacuated rather than a city that was never occupied in the first place. Country Garden's bankruptcy means the remaining phases of Forest City won't be built. The undeveloped portions of the artificial islands sit as empty, reclaimed land, ready for construction that will never happen. The company talks about finding buyers or partners to take over the project, but nobody wants it. The result is the world's newest and largest ghost city. Thousands of empty apartments and hundreds of empty towers on artificial islands that shouldn't exist, waiting for residents who will probably never come. In the region of Castilla-La Mancha in central Spain lies an airport with the longest runway in Europe. 4,200 meters of pristine tarmac, wide enough to handle the largest commercial aircraft in the world. There's a full terminal building, a control tower, hangars, taxiways, and a pedestrian bridge leading to a high-speed railway connection. It cost over €1 billion to build, and in the 3 years it was actually open as an airport, it handled fewer passengers than a mid-sized provincial bus station. It eventually went bankrupt and was put up for auction. A Chinese investment group submitted the winning bid of €10,000. This is the story of how Spain built one of the great infrastructure follies of the 21st century. The idea was born in the late 1990s when Spain's economy was booming. The country had adopted the euro. Interest rates were low, credit was flowing freely, and a wave of infrastructure investment was sweeping across the country. New motorways, high-speed railways, stadiums, convention centers. Madrid's main airport, Barajas, was genuinely overcrowded. The idea of a second major airport serving the capital region wasn't crazy. The chosen location was Ciudad Real, about 200 kilometers south of Madrid. The airport megaproject would have a high-speed rail link added to better serve the capital. Construction began in 2002, and the problem started almost immediately. The site sat inside a protected bird habitat and inside a dormant volcanic field, which the EU flagged as an environmental concern. Construction was halted while new assessments were carried out, delaying the opening by 4 years. By the time those delays were resolved and the airport was finally nearing completion, something significant had changed. Madrid's Barajas Airport had undergone a massive expansion, doubling its capacity to 70 million passengers a year. The original problem the Ciudad Real Airport was built to solve had quietly solved itself. Every airline that had been vaguely considering Ciudad Real now simply flew from Madrid instead. The airport finally opened in 2009 with a terminal designed for 10 million passengers a year. Its runway could handle an Airbus A380 and had been built to be a major international hub. However, only 2 airlines ever operated there, Ryanair and Vueling, and one of them required government subsidies to do so. That's because the airport just did not make any sense for visitors. An expanded Barajas had enough capacity for Spain's tourism industry, and it didn't lie 200 kilometers from the capital. In its best year, 2010, the airport handled around 33,000 passengers in total. Barajas was handling that many people every few hours. The high-speed rail station that was supposed to make the airport accessible was never built. Only the bridge connecting the terminal to the empty field where the station was supposed to be was ever completed. By 2012, just 3 years after opening, the airport operator filed for bankruptcy with debts of over 300 million euros. The gates closed, the check-in desks went dark, and the terminal began its transformation into one of the most eerily photogenic abandoned buildings in Spain. The runway sat empty. The control tower fell silent. The main regional savings bank that had funded much of the project collapsed shortly afterward, becoming the first Spanish bank to require a government bailout during the financial crisis. When the bankruptcy auction was held, the starting price was set at 100 million euros. Nobody bid. It was reduced to 28 million. Still, nobody bid. Eventually, a Chinese-led consortium called Zanin International submitted the only offer, 10,000 euros, and the Spanish courts, somewhat understandably, rejected it as insulting. The airport finally sold in 2018 for 56 million euros, about 5% of what it had cost to build. The pandemic gave the airport a lease of life. It served as an aircraft storage facility for grounded planes from airlines including Virgin Atlantic and Cathay Pacific. Film crews have used it as a location. Jean-Claude Van Damme once did his famous splits between 2 moving trucks on the deserted tarmac for a Volvo commercial. In 2024, the Spanish government briefly floated the idea of converting it into a migrant reception center, but local opposition quickly killed that plan too. So for now, Ciudad Real Airport remains exactly what it has been for most of its existence, a billion-euro monument to the gap between a very confident plan and a very uncomfortable reality. Europe does not have a shortage of confident plans that could not bridge the gap with reality. However, none of them come close to what Britain wanted to build to replace one of the world's biggest airports. The 1940s, when the first reactors went critical for the Manhattan Project. For over 80 years, that waste has been. By the 1980s, the situation was becoming untenable. Over 70,000 metric tons of high-level nuclear waste sat at more than 100 sites in 39 states, most of them near population centers, all of them temporary solutions waiting for a permanent answer. Congress decided in 1987 that the permanent answer would be Yucca Mountain, a remote ridge in the Nevada desert about 100 miles northwest of Las Vegas. The location seemed ideal, geologically stable, extremely dry, far from population centers, on land the federal government already owned for nuclear testing. The plan called for tunneling deep into the mountain to create a repository that could safely store 77,000 metric tons of nuclear waste for 10,000 years. The waste would be sealed in corrosion-resistant containers and buried 1,000 feet underground in tunnels carved through volcanic rock, isolated from groundwater and protected by Nevada's arid climate. The Department of Energy projected that Yucca Mountain could open by 1998 at a cost of about $1 billion. Nuclear utilities would pay fees into a fund that would finance construction and operation, and America's nuclear waste problem would finally have a solution. The waste sitting in temporary storage at reactor sites could be transported to Nevada and buried permanently, eliminating the risk of accidents or contamination at dozens of locations nationwide. Nevada exploded in opposition. State officials, environmental groups, and residents near the site argued that the federal government was turning Nevada into America's nuclear dumping ground. The state hadn't chosen this. Congress had forced it on them through the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which specifically designated Yucca Mountain after considering and rejecting sites in other states. Nevada had no nuclear power plants of its own, but would receive everyone else's waste. The politics were toxic from the start, with Nevadans feeling they'd been unfairly targeted because their state lacked the political power to resist. Despite Nevada's opposition, site characterization began in the early 1990s. The Department of Energy started extensive geological studies, drilling boreholes, conducting seismic surveys, and analyzing the rock formations. A 5-mile exploratory tunnel was bored into the mountain using a tunnel boring machine that carved a passage 25 feet in diameter through the volcanic tuff. The tunnel allowed scientists to directly examine the geology and test whether Yucca Mountain could actually contain nuclear waste as predicted. The geological studies revealed complications. The water table was higher than initial surveys suggested, meaning contamination could potentially reach groundwater faster than models predicted. Earthquake faults ran closer to the site than originally thought. The volcanic rock was more porous in some areas, raising questions about how quickly radiation could migrate. Each discovery required new analysis and revised predictions, and Nevada's opponents used every finding as evidence that the site was unsuitable. The cost estimates started climbing as the technical challenges became clearer. By the late 1990s, projections reached $8 billion. By 2005, estimates hit $15 billion. The 1998 opening date had long since passed, replaced by targets of 2010, then 2017, then 2020. Each delay cost money for ongoing studies and maintenance of a site that wasn't accepting waste. The project progressed despite Nevada's resistance. In 2002, after years of study and debate, the Department of Energy officially recommended Yucca Mountain to President Bush, and Congress approved it over Nevada's objection. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission began the licensing process to authorize construction. The repository seemed on track to finally open in the 2000s. Then politics intervened decisively. Barack Obama won the 2008 presidential election with strong support from Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, a Nevada Democrat who'd made stopping Yucca Mountain his personal crusade. In 2010, the Obama administration announced it was terminating the project. The Department of Energy withdrew its license application with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, defunded the program, and created a commission to study alternatives to Yucca Mountain. The cancellation came after spending over $15 billion on studies, tunnel construction, and licensing work. The 5-mile exploratory tunnel was complete. Detailed geological characterization had been done. The license application was pending. The project was years away from actually storing waste, but billions had been spent proving the site was viable. Nevada celebrated the decision as a victory. Federal officials who'd spent careers working on Yucca Mountain were reassigned or retired. The facility that was supposed to solve America's nuclear waste problem was abandoned, and the waste remains exactly where it's been for decades, sitting in temporary storage at reactor sites across the country. The Yucca Mountain site still exists, essentially mothballed. The exploratory tunnel is there, sealed but intact. The surface facilities are maintained at a minimal level. The waste problem Yucca Mountain was supposed to solve hasn't gone away. It's gotten worse. Over 90,000 metric tons of spent fuel now sits at reactor sites, more than Yucca Mountain was designed to hold. Some reactors have shut down but can't fully decommission because their waste has nowhere to go. The temporary solutions from the 1970s and 1980s are still in place 50 years later, with no permanent alternative in sight. Congress occasionally discusses reviving Yucca Mountain. The Trump administration tried to restart the licensing process in 2017, but faced Nevada's continued opposition and couldn't secure funding. The Biden administration showed no interest in pursuing it. The political dynamics haven't changed. Nevada still opposes the repository, and no other state wants to volunteer as a replacement. The waste continues sitting in temporary storage because the permanent solution was abandoned after $15 billion and 30 years of work. The political opposition from Nevada, combined with changing federal priorities, killed a project that was closer to completion than most abandoned megaprojects ever get. London has a problem that has been annoying planners, politicians, and airline executives for the better part of a century. Its main airport, Heathrow, is in completely the wrong place. It sits to the west of the city, which means aircraft on approach have to fly low directly over millions of people's homes. It's hemmed in by suburbs on all sides, making expansion a political nightmare. It operates at nearly full capacity, with 2 runways handling more flights than almost any other airport in the world. And the obvious solution, build a new hub airport somewhere less constrained, has been proposed, studied, debated, shelved, resurrected, and killed again so many times that it has become one of the great recurring dramas of British public life. The idea of putting an airport in the Thames Estuary to the east of London goes back to the 1940s. The logic was always the same. The estuary is relatively unpopulated. It's close enough to the city to be practical, and building over water avoids the problem of displacing tens of thousands of residents. However, many versions of the idea came and went over the decades, always colliding with the same environmental concerns, costs, and the immense political difficulty of shutting down Heathrow and the enormous economic ecosystem built around it. In 2008, Boris Johnson, then Mayor of London, picked the idea back up and ran with it harder than anyone before him. Johnson's vision wasn't just for a new runway or 2. It was for an entirely new 4-runway hub airport built on an artificial island in the estuary, capable of handling 150 million passengers a year. It would replace Heathrow entirely. The new airport would be connected to central London by high-speed rail in under 30 minutes, with links north to the rest of the country and south through the Channel Tunnel to Europe. The press quickly dubbed it Boris Island, and the name stuck. Johnson spent the next 6 years promoting the idea with characteristic enthusiasm, commissioning studies, hiring architects, and making the case publicly at every opportunity. By 2013, the scheme had been developed into a detailed proposal costing an estimated £47 billion just for the airport itself, with a further £25 billion or more needed for road and rail connections. The total bill, depending on which version of the plan you looked at, ran anywhere between £70 billion and £100 billion. For context, that's more than the entire annual NHS budget. The problems were stacking up even as Johnson kept pushing. In September 2014, the government's Independent Airports Commission delivered its verdict. It rejected Boris Island entirely, concluding that the project had substantial disadvantages that collectively outweigh its potential benefits. The economic disruption of closing Heathrow would be enormous. The environmental hurdles might prove impossible to overcome. Potentially £60 billion in government funding alone was simply too large to justify when cheaper options existed. Meanwhile, the estuary remains empty of airports, the birds continue their migration, and the idea of Boris Island has joined the long list of grand British infrastructure proposals that made perfect sense on paper and proved utterly impossible in practice. Did you enjoy these stories of abandoned megaprojects? Is there still hope for any of these megabuilds? Let us know in the comments. Despite these failures, there is no shortage of massive infrastructure projects under construction today. Check those out in our video on the biggest megaprojects under construction in the world 2026. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.